Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. In the Goblet of Fire, the world of Harry Potter opened wider than ever before. Students from two other wizarding schools, Beauxbaton and Durmstrang, arrived at Hogwarts. But few know that there are actually many more such schools. J.K. Rowling has confirmed the existence of at least 11 magical institutions, though only 8 are described in any real detail. Each school is unique in its own way. Like the Hogwarts houses, they reflect values, culture, and even philosophy. In this piece, I invite you to imagine an alternate reality. What if our favorite characters had studied at different wizarding schools? Enjoy the journey. Number 1, Voldemort, Durmstrang. Durmstrang has a dark reputation and places significant emphasis on the dark arts in its curriculum. Rumour has it that Muggle-borns are not accepted, and only purebloods may walk its halls. It's the perfect place for young Tom Riddle. Surrounded by peers who share his ideology and granted access to forbidden knowledge, he might not only have thrived, he might have risen to power even sooner. At Durmstrang, he wouldn't need to hide his nature. He could nurture it with the approval of his teachers. Number 2. Hermione Granger, Ilvermorny. Ilvermorny, the American School of Magic, is one of the most progressive and inclusive in the wizarding world. It was founded by Isolde Sayre, a descendant of Salazar Slytherin who rejected his beliefs, and her Muggle husband. From the very beginning, the school stood for equality and acceptance. For Hermione, a Muggle-born witch fiercely devoted to justice and the rights of magical beings, Ilvermorny could have been more than a safe haven. It might have been a source of genuine inspiration. Her ideals would not be met with resistance there. They would be embraced as part of the school's core philosophy. Number 3. Severus Snape, Mahutokoro. Mahutokoro, the elite Japanese school of magic, is known for its strict academic discipline, emphasis on potion-making, and high achievement in international competitions. It's hard to imagine a better fit for Severus Snape. His brilliance, focus, love of precise magical sciences, and most of all, his talent in potions would have made him a star at Mahutokoro. Perhaps there his genius would have been recognized earlier than at Hogwarts, and his life might have taken a gentler path. Number 4. Rubeus Hagrid, Castelobruxo. Castelobruxo, the Brazilian wizarding school, is famous for its focus on herbology and magical creatures. Nestled in the Amazon rainforest, the school seems almost alive, a part of nature itself. Hagrid, with his deep love for magical beasts of all sizes, regardless of danger, would have felt right at home there. Rather than being expelled for his recklessness, he would have been supported and guided. At Castelobruxo, his knowledge wouldn't have been a concern. It would have been valued as a rare gift. Number 5. James Potter, Ouagadougou. Ouagadougou, the African school of magic located in the Mountains of the Moon, is known for its exceptional transfiguration program. There, students perform magic without wands and many become skilled animagi. James Potter was just such a wizard, an animagus, a transfiguration prodigy, mischievous and yet immensely gifted. Ouagadougou could have helped him tap even deeper into his potential. Even a brief exchange program might have opened him to ancient, powerful forms of magic he never knew. Number 6. Percy Weasley, Beauxbaton. Beauxbaton, the French Academy of Magic, holds elegance, order, and tradition in the highest regard. It's the ideal school for someone whose life runs on structure and ambition. Percy, obsessed with rules and climbing the career ladder, would have felt completely in his element, and perhaps under the influence of noble students like Fleur Delacour, who behind her grace hides intelligence, loyalty, and courage. He might have learned to balance ambition with compassion, something he often lacked at Hogwarts. Number 7. Victor Krum, Hogwarts. Not every Durmstrang student walks the path of darkness. Victor Krum is a quiet, honest, and even shy young man who fell for Hermione regardless of her blood status. He fought against Voldemort and rejected Grindelwald's ideology. At Hogwarts, a place of openness and friendship, Krum might have grown into a true leader, not in the shadows but in the light. The Sorting Hat would likely have placed him in Gryffindor for his bravery, loyalty, and willingness to go against the crowd in pursuit of what's right. Number 8. Luna Lovegood, Beauxbaton. Luna Lovegood moved through Hogwarts like a dream drifting through stone. Students laughed at her earrings, her butterbeer cork necklace, her talk of Nargles. "You're just as sane as I am," she told Harry once, eyes wide with knowing. But at Beauxbaton, where art met magic and beauty was more than skin-deep, Luna's strangeness would have been celebrated, not mocked. Beauxbaton prized elegance, but not only in appearance. Thought, emotion, magic, all were forms of expression. Luna, with her otherworldly calm and fearless curiosity, would have thrived in its halls of glass and marble. She might have wandered the enchanted rose garden, speaking softly to fairies only she could see. And instead of sneers, she'd have received nods. In a school that valued originality, her search for crumple-horned snorkax could have been seen as noble exploration, not nonsense. Perhaps there, Luna would have found friends not just tolerant, but like her. Fellow dreamers, seers, believers in things not yet proven. And in that golden light of Beauxbaton, she would not have seemed misplaced. She would have shone, as bright and strange as ever, but no longer alone. Number 9. Draco Malfoy, Durmstrang. Draco Malfoy walked through Hogwarts like he owned the stone beneath his shoes. Raised on stories of bloodlines and power, he carried himself with entitlement, but behind the sneer was something more fragile. "You wait," he told Harry once. "You'll be next, mudbloods and muggle lovers first." But his threats were learned, not earned. At Durmstrang, where blood purity wasn't a private belief but a public standard, Draco would have fit in without the need to posture. Surrounded by peers who shared his values, he wouldn't have had to shout so loudly to be heard. In the cold, militaristic halls of Durmstrang, weakness was tested by discipline, not mocked behind prefect badges. Under a headmaster like Igor Karkaroff, Draco might have discovered that cruelty alone wins no loyalty. He would have been challenged not by enemies like Harry, but by allies who expected strength, clarity, and purpose. Maybe then he'd have asked himself sooner whether the path he followed was truly his own. When he stood trembling in the room of requirement, wand shaking, face pale, it was clear. Draco had been a boy handed power, but never taught what to do with it. Durmstrang might have given him more than a legacy. It could have forged him. In another life, far from the shadow of Lucius, he might have become a man not defined by fear, but by choice. Number 10. Neville Longbottom, Castelabruxo. Neville Longbottom bloomed late, but the seed had always been there. He cradled his Mimblus Mimbletonia, like others, held wands. "It's really rare," he told Harry, eyes glowing. At Castelabruxo, hidden deep in the Amazon rainforest, that same plant would have grown wild around his dormitory. The school prized magical botany, and Neville would have walked its lush grounds like a native speaker in a forest of magic. In Hogwarts he was often dismissed, forgetful, shy. He stuttered under Snape's gaze and froze in front of his classmates. But in Castelabruxo, where communication with plants was an art, not an afterthought, Neville's quiet strength would have shone. There, professors didn't reward loud wands. They respected patience, an ability to listen. In that humid green world he might have become a prodigy, a master of devil's snare, snargle of pods and whispering orchids no one in Britain had ever seen. By the time he killed Nagini, he had become a hero. But what if he had believed in himself sooner? What if his courage had been nurtured, not tested? Castelabruxo would not have waited for prophecy to tell him he mattered. It would have handed him gloves, shears, and a spade, and shown him that growing things can change the world. Number 11. Fred and George Weasley, Ilvermorny. Fred and George Weasley were fireworks in human form. At Hogwarts they lit up corridors with jokes, potions, and pranks that made even the portraits laugh, but not every professor appreciated them. "They make trouble," McGonagall muttered more than once, her lips twitching despite herself. What if they'd grown up not at the foot of the astronomy tower, but in the enchanted woods surrounding Ilvermorny? In a school where individuality wasn't punished, but praised. Ilvermorny cherished imagination. It honoured courage, wit, and invention equally. There, Fred and George wouldn't have had to sneak around to test their fainting fancies or puking pastilles. Teachers might have watched with interest, not scowls. Pukwudgie House, known for heart and healing, or Wampus for bravery and daring, would have welcomed them. In such an environment, their joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, might not have been born out of rebellion. It could have been a school-sponsored project. When they flew off into the sky during Umbridge's reign, leaving behind a corridor of whirling fireworks, they became legends. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred had shouted. At Ilvermorny that moment might have come earlier, not as escape, but as a performance. Their brilliance wasn't made for quiet classrooms and strict timetables. It was made for spark and chaos and joy, and Ilvermorny would have handed them the matches. Number 12. Bellatrix Lestrange, Durmstrang. Bellatrix Lestrange burned with dark fire long before she met the Dark Lord. At Hogwarts she sat in the green-lit dungeons of Slytherin, where whispers of power passed between pure-blood heirs. But Hogwarts was not built for her hunger. Its rules, its restraints, the quiet disapproval of professors like McGonagall, it all grated against her. "The Dark Lord will rise again, sissy," she once hissed, wild-eyed and devoted. But if she had been shaped at Durmstrang, not merely tolerated at Hogwarts, the story might have changed. Durmstrang embraced what others feared. Its very curriculum included the dark arts, not just defense. There, Bellatrix's obsession with power would have found structure. She might have studied under a figure like Igor Karkaroff or even his predecessor, who taught cruelty with calculation. She would have learned to cast pain not from impulse but from precision. Not wild laughter, but cold mastery. With guidance, her magic might have been terrifying not just in chaos but in control. Perhaps she would still have met Voldemort. Perhaps she would have still fallen to her knees for him. But the Bellatrix of Durmstrang might have been more than a fanatic. She could have become a rival, a general, not a servant driven by madness, but a commander shaped by ancient blood magic and centuries of northern discipline. In another school, in another life, her fury might have worn armor and not chains. Number 13, Cho Chang, Mahutokoro. Cho Chang carried herself like moonlight, gentle, thoughtful, and just out of reach. In the storm of Hogwarts, where emotions crashed louder than spells, she often felt adrift. Her tears for Cedric Diggory were quiet, but deep, and her attempts to move forward met judgment instead of compassion. Yet if she had studied at Mahutokoro, Japan's revered magical school on the volcanic island of Minami Iwo Jima, things might have been different. Mahutokoro demanded discipline. There, robes changed color with achievement, pale pink for beginners, gold for excellence, and white for disgrace. Cho would have worn gold early. She was a skilled seeker on the Ravenclaw team and known for her precise spellwork. "She flies like a bird," Harry once thought, watching her in awe on the Quidditch pitch. At Mahutokoro, where Quidditch teams were trained with near-military coordination, Cho could have been among champions, focused, sharp, and supported by teammates who thrived on order. Surrounded by students who moved as one, who studied late into the night not from pressure, but from pride, she might have felt safe. She might have found a way to grieve without eyes watching her every move. At Mahutokoro, where magic was a balance between strength and harmony, her emotions would not have made her weak. They would have made her human. Her calm nature would be honored, her silence understood. There is strength in quietness. In Mahutokoro, where the sea crashes against stone below the school walls and the wind carries centuries of tradition, Cho would not have been a sad girl crying in the room of requirement. She would have been something else, a leader, a seeker not only on the broom, but of wisdom. In that school of wind, stone, and fire, she might have finally found the stillness she was always searching for. Number 14. Minerva McGonagall, Wagadu. Minerva McGonagall stood tall at Hogwarts, sharp, proud, unbending as a wand of yew. But what if her journey had begun far from the stone halls of Scotland? What if she had studied at Wagadu, the great wizarding school carved into the mountains of the moon? There, magic was not cast with flicks of oak and phoenix feather, but with the mind and the will. Transfiguration was not just a subject, it was a language shared with spirits, animals, and the very breath of nature. McGonagall, already gifted, might have risen beyond even her own legend in such a place. She was a registered animagus, a tabby cat with distinctive spectacle-like markings around her eyes, a rare and difficult magical feat. But imagine her training among Wagadu's best, alongside witches who could turn into mist or become creatures from ancestral dreams. Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts, she once warned her class. At Wagadu, that warning would not be spoken, it would be lived. Their focus on internal mastery would have shaped Minerva's magic from the inside out, fusing discipline with spiritual power. In the African highlands, her stern demeanor would not have been called cold, it would have been called sacred. Among the Wagadu elders, who wore carved stones to mark their magical achievements, she would not have been an outsider. She would have been revered. Her love for rules, her passion for order, her respect for ancient magical lore, these would not be questioned, they would be honored. Wagadu taught silence, stillness, the magic of gesture, breath, and thought. McGonagall's world had been one of textbooks and exam scores, but Wagadu's world whispered through the trees. Had she stood there at sunrise watching a peer vanish into a falcon without so much as a whisper, it's possible even Minerva, ever rational, ever logical, might have closed her eyes and believed that magic too could be a prayer. Number 15. Sirius Black, Castello Bruxo. Sirius Black never fit easily into any mould, least of all the one carved for him by the proud, pure-blood Black family. Even at Hogwarts, a place that promised magical freedom and exploration, Sirius always seemed just slightly out of step with its traditions and rigid expectations. His house, Gryffindor, became a refuge from his family's ideals, but it was never quite a sanctuary for his soul. He found loyalty in his friends, especially James Potter, but found little resonance with the structure of the school or its curriculum. It is not hard to imagine, then, a different trajectory for Sirius. Had he studied not at Hogwarts, but at Castello Bruxo, the Brazilian wizarding school buried deep in the lush Amazon, his life might have unfolded with a new kind of magic. Castello Bruxo is known less for formality and more for its pulse of wild magic, its reverence for nature, and a focus on magical creatures and herbology. In such a setting, Sirius, always a creature of instinct and fire, could have flourished. At Hogwarts, he was taught to transfigure matches and memorize potion ingredients. At Castello Bruxo, he would have been guided into the rainforest to connect with elemental forces, to learn the ancient rhythms of the jungle, where Hogwarts' ancient halls echoed with the pride of lineage and the weight of centuries of tradition. Castello Bruxo thrummed with a primal energy that matched the beating of Sirius's restless heart. One can easily picture Sirius standing barefoot in the red soil, beneath a heavy green canopy, his wand lowered, his fingers outstretched toward a curupira, a jungle guardian with backward feet, known to play tricks on intruders. Unlike the strict instructions given by Professor Kettleburn at Hogwarts, the Castello Bruxo method would have required intuition, empathy, and trust. Sirius, whose own empathy was often hidden behind smirks and sarcasm, would have learned to access it fully. In doing so, he might have discovered the grounding he always lacked, a bond with something older, deeper than human society or magical bureaucracy. At Hogwarts, Sirius was intelligent but restless, capable of top marks but disinterested in academic glory. His detentions piled up like trophies. He rebelled for the sake of rebellion, often because there was little else to do. McGonagall once said, "Sirius Black seems to think life is a joke." In truth, Life at Hogwarts never offered Sirius the kind of meaningful risk he craved. Castello would not have required him to rebel because its very structure leaned into freedom. Lessons were not always taught in classrooms but in living ecosystems. Rules existed, but they were elastic, meant to protect, not constrain. The forest would have been Sirius's greatest teacher and perhaps his most honest mirror. Sirius's Patronus was a dog, a symbol of loyalty and protection, but also of wildness and untamed spirit. At Castello, such a Patronus would not have been merely a protective charm, but an identity to be honored and explored. Shamans of the region, magical elders known as pages, might have led him through dream journeys to understand his animagus form, not just to become a dog, but to know what it meant to live as one. The lessons would not be about skill, but about essence. Sirius's transformation into Padfoot, taught at Hogwarts in secret and practiced in shadows, could have been celebrated openly. Rather than a secret escape, it could have been a rite of self-discovery. The bond Sirius shared with his friends was powerful, but there is reason to believe he needed more than brotherhood. He needed a place to belong, not just socially, but spiritually. Castello, with its emphasis on inner harmony and balance with nature, could have offered that. Perhaps he would have joined the student patrols through the jungle, fending off illegal magical poachers and protecting sacred magical groves. Such a purpose would have spoken to the core of his being, fighting for something real, not against the abstract idea of authority, but for the preservation of life and wild magic, might have changed the trajectory of his life. In the Amazon, Sirius might have studied alongside creatures few at Hogwarts ever encountered. He would have learned from the Iara, water spirits who sang from rivers, and from the Kaipora, mischievous guardians of the forest, who appeared only to those they trusted. These weren't creatures to be studied in books, but forces to be lived with. Perhaps Sirius, who lived in the shadow of a cold and loveless home, would have found in these magical beings a strange form of kinship. They too existed at the margins, defying human logic and resisting control. One cannot ignore the contrast between the punishment Sirius received at Hogwarts and the possibilities that might have awaited him elsewhere. At Hogwarts, his attempt to trick Snape into following Remus during a full moon was treated as a dangerous prank, reckless and cruel. It was, in truth, a cry for something more visceral, more real. At Castello, students were expected to confront the wild as a part of their education. Danger was not hidden behind stone walls, but woven into everyday life. A boy like Sirius, always pushing boundaries, would have been trained to understand them, not merely told to obey. His eventual fall, from beloved godfather to prisoner in Azkaban, was a tragedy of miscommunication, mistrust, and misunderstood identity. Had he studied at Castello, his talents might have been nurtured in ways that prevented such an outcome. That school emphasized community and symbiosis, not hierarchy. Perhaps within such a framework, Sirius would have learned not only how to defy, but how to lead. He had the soul of a revolutionary, but lacked a cause that spoke to his heart. Castello might have given him one, not of war, but of guardianship. It is interesting to imagine how Sirius might have responded to Castello-Bruxo's unique approach to magical ethics. While Hogwarts taught defense against the dark arts as a combat discipline, Castello-Bruxo encouraged students to question what darkness really meant. Magic was not labeled by origin, but by intention. There, Sirius would have been challenged not simply to fight evil, but to understand the nature of power. For a boy raised in the shadows of a supremacist household, such discussions could have led to profound healing. Number 16, Peter Pettigrew, Mahutukoro. Of all the characters whose fate in the Harry Potter universe seems sealed by fear and weakness, Peter Pettigrew stands out as a tragic figure whose transformation into a traitor was not inevitable but circumstantial. Born with magical abilities and placed in the same house as some of the most daring and noble wizards of his generation, he lacked the internal scaffolding to match their courage. But what if the problem wasn't only Peter's character? What if the school itself failed him by nurturing qualities in others that overshadowed him and rewarded strength over growth? What if Peter Pettigrew had not studied at Hogwarts, but had instead been shaped by the austere discipline of Mahoutokoro, the prestigious wizarding school of Japan? At Hogwarts, Peter found himself at the bottom of a hierarchy defined by boldness. He gravitated toward James Potter and Sirius Black, boys who were larger than life, duelists, pranksters, and natural-born leaders. Remus Lupin, quiet yet powerful, had his own gravity. Peter, feeling like a background detail in his own life, chose the path of least resistance: dependence. The Sorting Hat, which placed him in Gryffindor, saw a faint spark of courage, but it overestimated his readiness to grow into it. His years at Hogwarts taught him to cling to strength rather than cultivate it. Contrast that with Mahoutokoro, where discipline is a sacred practice and each student's robe reflects their moral and academic progress. There, robes begin pale pink and shift in color as the student's skills develop: white for exceptional academic performance, gold for excellence in magical disciplines, but green, ominously, for any involvement with dark magic. Cheating, deceit, or betrayal are punished by instant expulsion, and the shame brought upon one's family can be lasting. In such an environment, a young Peter Pettigrew could not have hidden behind charisma or proximity to power. He would have had to earn everything on his own. At Mahoutokoro there is no marauders clique, no roaming through secret tunnels, no invisibility cloaks passed between pranksters. There is instead a collective responsibility. Students train on the volcanic slopes of the island of Minami Iwo Jima, where self-control is tested by the natural forces around them. Under such conditions, Peter's craving for approval might have been transformed into a hunger for internal strength, surrounded not by boisterous laughter and arrogance, but by silent determination and spiritual harmony. He may have come to understand that identity is forged, not borrowed. Imagine a young Peter in pale robes, standing among a group of classmates during morning flight training over the sea. The robes of others around him begin to glow white, one by one, as they master advanced magical theory. He notices his own has not changed, but instead of shrinking into himself, he is pushed by the quiet culture of effort and reflection to work harder, to seek guidance not from loud leaders, but from teachers who model discipline and kindness. In Mahoutokoro, fame and boldness are not admired, diligence is. That could have been Peter's salvation. There is a reason Mahoutokoro produces some of the finest seers and spell designers in the world. Their students are trained to confront their own shortcomings early, with no illusion of protection by peer groups. Peter's weakness at Hogwarts was not his lack of intelligence or skill. He managed complex magic like the animagus transformation. His weakness was his absence of self-worth. In Mahoutokoro, every student is taught that their worth is not granted by others, it is cultivated from within. The robe system would have made Peter's flirtation with dark magic impossible to conceal. At Hogwarts, his descent was quiet, masked by the wars around him and the shadow of more prominent figures. But at Mahoutokoro, the first sign of loyalty to Voldemort would have turned his robe green, a living indictment visible to all. The shame, the dishonor, and the immediate consequences might have jolted him out of his spiral long before he gave up his soul to serve darkness. Peter's betrayal was not a moment but a slow collapse. It began with self-doubt, deepened with fear, and ended in surrender. At Mahoutokoro, surrender is not an option. Their spellcasting curriculum includes rigorous meditation and mental fortification. Students are taught to resist legilimency, not to lie, but to protect truth. Peter, so susceptible to influence, would have developed a shield of mental integrity, not just to defend against external pressure, but to face the pressure within. We know from canon that Peter was capable of advanced magic. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Sirius says bitterly, he's not worth it, he's never been worth it, but that's not entirely true. Peter's ability to remain an animagus undetected for years, his complex magical transformations, and his creation of the Silver Hand through Voldemort's magic, all these suggest potential. The tragedy is that no one, not even Peter, believed that potential belonged to him, Mahotakoro could have changed that belief system from the start. Let us not forget that Mahotakoro students fly on storm-driven winds, surfing typhoons on enchanted brooms. Cowards do not survive such rituals. A coward must become something else or fall. Peter's desire to escape death, which ultimately led to betrayal, could have been alchemized into discipline under such pressure. The terror of punishment at Mahotakoro is not physical but spiritual. It is not Voldemort's wrath that terrifies. It is the loss of honor, the disappointment of elders, the silent turn of one's own robe. Even the faculty at Mahotakoro would have reshaped him. Headmaster Ayaka Kamoshida, a practitioner of wandless magic and a master of ancestral enchantments, believes in confronting the roots of fear. Her mentorship, steeped in quiet rigor, would not have allowed Peter to hide behind louder voices. Under her guidance, Peter would have been asked not, "What do you want?" but, "What do you fear?" And then he would have been asked to face it, again and again, until it no longer ruled him. Number 17. Narcissa Malfoy Beauxbaton. Narcissa Malfoy walked the corridors of Hogwarts with a serenity that demanded attention, but not affection. Draped in emeralds and shadows, her presence among the Slytherins was expected, almost inevitable, a pure-blood heiress with a lineage carved into the bones of wizarding Britain. But there was always a tension behind her porcelain poise, a sense that she was performing a role rather than living her truth. While others in Slytherin House, like Bellatrix, her sister, or the cunning Severus Snape, thrived in the cutthroat cold of the dungeons, Narcissa maintained a dignified distance, as if her heart longed for a different kind of magic altogether. Perhaps that longing pointed across the Channel to the south of France, where a white palace shimmered in the mountains, Beauxbaton Academy of Magic. It's easy to overlook Narcissa. She does not shout, she does not fight in public. She whispers and wins. While other characters in the wizarding world fight with wands and fury, Narcissa's battlefield is etiquette, alliances, and the glacial chessboard of aristocratic influence. At Beauxbaton, where grace is not a weakness but a form of strength, Narcissa would have been more than an ornament of pure blood society. She would have been a queen in her own right, a master of refinement, yes, but also of resilience cloaked in velvet. Madame Olympe Maxime, the headmistress of Beauxbaton, fostered an environment where students were taught not only how to duel, but how to carry themselves with pride, flair, and emotional intelligence. Beauxbaton was not a place of loud ambition like Hogwarts, nor one of narrow tradition like Durmstrang. It was a citadel for the cultivated soul. One imagines Narcissa among the polished marble halls and rose-tinted courtyards of that school, where the scent of enchanted flowers lingered in the air, and the sky seemed endlessly blue. There she would have been encouraged to refine her natural gifts, not to suppress them in service of a legacy she never chose. In Slytherin, loyalty to bloodlines and the cunning game of power defined one's worth. Narcissa learned to survive by those rules, but they never truly shaped her. She was not cruel like Bellatrix, nor as openly ambitious as Lucius. She married because it was expected, bore a son as was tradition, and maintained her role with flawless decorum. But beneath her ice-white exterior there was a fire carefully banked. Her most powerful moment came not with a wand, but with a lie. In the Forbidden Forest, when Voldemort demanded she check if Harry Potter was alive, she bent over the boy who lived and quietly asked, "Is Draco alive?" When Harry nodded, she stood, turned to the Dark Lord, and lied to his face. "He is dead." That lie changed the course of the war. Narcissa's decision in that moment was not born of cowardice or loyalty to Voldemort's cause. It was born of maternal instinct, of independent choice. It was the moment she stepped out of the mold that society cast for her. In Beauxbaton, such emotional clarity and personal strength would not have been buried under generations of dogma. It would have been nurtured, encouraged, and celebrated. Where Hogwarts often molded its students into chess pieces of its internal rivalries, Beauxbaton raised its students to become artworks, living expressions of their own identity. Imagine Narcissa studying under the tutelage of instructors who valued charm work, emotional intelligence, and social nuance as much as transfiguration or potions. Her aptitude for non-verbal magic, hinted at in the canon, would have blossomed under such care. Among her classmates, she might have been close with figures like Fleur Delacour, another blonde vision of icy elegance, misunderstood by those who only saw the surface. Fleur was judged at Hogwarts for her accent and beauty, but in Beauxbatons she was a champion. Narcissa would have recognized a kindred spirit in her. Two women groomed by expectation, fighting to be seen on their own terms. In contrast, her time at Hogwarts bound her more tightly to the constraints of British wizarding aristocracy. Slytherin taught her to be clever, cautious, and cunning, but not free. In those stone halls, one's future was often already written. The Black family expected her to maintain the bloodline, to marry advantageously, to continue the legacy. Perhaps even her choice of Lucius Malfoy was not entirely her own. Beauxbatons, however, might have offered a path less constrained. In the French magical tradition, individuality often trumps inheritance. A Beauxbatons Narcissa might have discovered passions beyond lineage, potions brewed for beauty, charms for harmony, magics that speak to soul rather than state. The aesthetic of Beauxbatons matched Narcissa's own aura. While Hogwarts, particularly Slytherin, exuded damp shadows and ancestral pride, Beauxbatons was elegance incarnate, tall windows, sunlit parlours, fine porcelain tea sets, and gardens filled with enchanted butterflies. The environment itself would have called to her sensibilities. She was a woman who wore elegance like armour. In that place, her style would have been more than just a statement. It would have been seen as an extension of her magical essence. This change of environment could have fundamentally altered Narcissa's choices later in life. Without the rigid indoctrination of pure blood supremacy that coloured the British magical education, she might have developed a more nuanced view of the world. Perhaps she would not have aligned herself with Lucius, nor tolerated the presence of Voldemort in her home. One wonders whether she would have supported Dumbledore's cause in quiet, subtle ways. An informant among the elite, passing whispers of rebellion over tea in Parisian salons. There are glimpses of this potential in canon. Despite her status as a Death Eater's wife, Narcissa is never branded with the dark mark. She avoids open violence. She keeps her son out of the inner circle as long as she can. She conspires with Snape to protect Draco, not to serve the Dark Lord, but to shield her family. These are not the actions of a fanatic. They are the careful, considered steps of a woman caught in a web she never wove. Had she been raised in an environment that valued personal agency over blood loyalty, she might have cut the web before it ever bound her. Number 18, Remus Lupin, Ilvermorny. In the shadowed corridors of Hogwarts, beneath the flickering torchlight and the echoing laughter of students too young to understand the burden of monstrosity, walked a boy whose every heartbeat was a quiet apology. Remus John Lupin, intelligent, kind, and gentle to the point of self-erasure. A boy whose condition branded him not just a werewolf, but a pariah. He arrived at Hogwarts with second-hand robes and the heavy weight of a secret that could unravel everything. Dumbledore, always the outlier in the storm of wizarding prejudice, allowed him entrance. But permission was not the same as welcome, and Hogwarts, for all its magic and wonder, remained a castle with eyes that sometimes looked away when kindness was needed most. There was a place, however, far across the Atlantic, nestled atop the peak of Mount Greylock in Massachusetts, where the old magic of the world mingled with a new philosophy. Ilvermorny, a school born not of ancient bloodlines, but of compassion, built by Isolde Serre, a descendant of Salazar Slytherin, who had rejected his cruel dogma. Isolde had fled persecution and pain, forging a home for magical children of all origins, no matter their blood, their legacy, or their beasts. If Remus Lupin had found himself beneath Ilvermorny's enchanted granite halls instead of Hogwarts's stone towers, one cannot help but wonder what might have changed. Ilvermorny sorted its students into 4 houses, just as Hogwarts did, but these houses, Thunderbird, Wampus, Horned Serpent, and Pukwudgie, did not mirror their British counterparts. They represented aspects of the soul, and Remus, with his ceaseless inner conflict and yearning for understanding, might have found solace in Pukwudgie, the house of the heart, of healers, of those who put others before themselves. The Pukwudgie house, named after the fiercely independent magical creature known for helping humans, prized compassion above all. Remus, who feared his own nature and yet risked everything to protect others, would have found himself honored there, not hidden. At Hogwarts, the solution to Remus's condition was concealment. Dumbledore arranged the Whomping Willow and the Shrieking Shack so Remus could transform out of sight, a plan of mercy cloaked in secrecy. But the transformation itself, violent, painful, isolating, was endured alone. The transformations were terrible. It is very painful to turn into a werewolf. I was separated from humans to bite, so I bit and scratched myself instead, Remus would later admit. It was a survival plan, not a support system. And though James, Sirius and Peter would become his companions in mischief and solace, they could not undo the world's contempt. They were children playing against centuries of stigma. Ilvermorny, unlike Hogwarts, had no embedded history of werewolf discrimination. In North America, the Department of Magical Creatures operated under different regulations than the British Ministry of Magic. Werewolves were still feared, yes, but Ilvermorny prided itself on being an institution that trained children, not judged them. Its founders had personally rescued magical beings deemed dangerous by others. Had Remus walked through Ilvermorny's doors, there's a chance he wouldn't have been relegated to a distant shack. He might have been given a room lined with charms of comfort, a mentor who saw the boy instead of the beast. Perhaps even classmates who didn't need to sneak into his transformations as animals to prove their friendship. Moreover, the magical creatures that influenced Ilvermorny's identity spoke of strength through duality. The Thunderbird, a creature that could summon storms with the flap of its wings, symbolized turmoil, transformation, and the journey through pain. Had Remus been sorted there, his lycanthropy may not have been a burden, but a right, a sign that he, like the Thunderbird, could harness pain into purpose. His curse could have been honored, not hidden. It is not difficult to imagine Ilvermorny professors trained in magical healing offering potions and spells to ease transformation pain, or even rituals older than European traditions to balance his dual existence. At Hogwarts, Remus often sat quietly at the back, hiding his tattered robes and hoping no one would ask too many questions. His brilliance in defense against the dark arts was always evident, but it was understated, like someone trying not to shine too brightly. He was the best defense against the dark arts teacher we've ever had, Harry would later say, not realizing the cruel irony that Remus had been deemed too dangerous to teach long-term because of the very condition that made him so compassionate. Hogwarts admired his mind but feared his blood. Ilvermorny, by contrast, may have made him a student mentor by 5th year. There, faculty encouraged students to aid younger ones, and Remus, with his natural empathy, it would have thrived. His talents could have blossomed earlier. In Ilvermorny, perhaps Remus would have studied ancient Native American transformation rituals, or delved into wand lore more deeply. After all, Isolde Sayer's family wand, once broken, had regrown in Ilvermorny soil. That metaphor alone, broken wand renewed, would have resonated with him. He could have led a student circle on magical creature rites. He might have had a familiar trained to assist during his transformations. He might have graduated not with relief that the secret was over, but with pride. And what of his later years? The British wizarding world turned him away again and again. Even the Order was reluctant to let me join at first. He once told Harry, "They think I'm a danger." But what if he'd come from a different world, one where lycanthropy was not equated with failure? What if he'd entered the war as an Ilvermorny graduate, confident in his strength and trained in more than just survival? He might have held more sway in the Order, or taught not just at Hogwarts for 1 year, but for many. He might have founded a program for magical youth living with conditions others called curses. The House of Pukwudgie, Ilvermorny's heart, would have taught him that service to others begins with honoring oneself. In Hogwarts he learned restraint. In Ilvermorny he might have learned celebration. He would not have begged Tonks not to love him, nor called his unborn child a foolish dream. He would have stood before the world as a man who bore a burden not with shame, but with sacred purpose. "I am what I am," he could have said, "and what I am is whole." When Remus Lupin returned to Hogwarts as a professor, it was as if the school welcomed him only when it needed him. And even then the old prejudices crept in. Parents protested, fear returned. He resigned not because he failed, but because the world failed him again. Had he worn Ilvermorny's robes, the resignation letter might never have been written. Or perhaps he would have written one. But to accept a greater position, leading a department of magical equality, or teaching defense at a higher institution. He might have authored a book, The Other Moon, Living with Lycanthropy and Light. In his youth, Remus tried to disappear, to make himself smaller. He never sought glory, but Ilvermorny, with its emphasis on community over hierarchy, might have allowed him to lead without fear. Imagine him, standing under the swirling carvings of Ilvermorny's central hall, teaching young witches and wizards that power comes not from purity, but from compassion. That to survive does not mean to hide, that the monster is often just a boy, wounded and waiting. Remus always feared that his condition would define him. In Ilvermorny, it may have refined him. For all his brilliance, his kindness, and his insight, he never believed he deserved love. In Ilvermorny, where even the name of the school was born from loss and healing, love was not something to be earned. It was given. That lesson alone could have changed his life. In his final battle, Remus Lupin died fighting for a world that had never quite accepted him. It is one of the cruelties of the wizarding world that such a man, who lived in the shadows so long, met his end in darkness. He died protecting a child who would never know him. But in Ilvermorny, perhaps he would not have had to fight for his right to exist. Perhaps he would have lived long enough to see that child grow. The story of Remus Lupin is not a tale of failure. It is a tale of the world failing him. And Ilvermorny, that distant haven, built not from blood but from love, might have rewritten his story. Not just a werewolf, not just a professor, but a leader, a healer, a name remembered not only in sacrifice but in joy. Had he stepped through Ilvermorny's carved wooden doors instead of platform 9 3/4, the boy who apologized with every glance might have become the man who inspired with every word. And perhaps, just perhaps, he would have smiled more. Number 19, Nymphadora Tonks, Wagadu. Of all the dazzling characters in the Harry Potter universe, few are as vivid, electric, and unmistakably unforgettable as Nymphadora Tonks. From the moment she burst into the narrative, tripping over a piece of furniture with a cheerful "Watcher, Harry," she established herself as someone who didn't follow paths, but rather forged her own with gleeful defiance. A metamorphmagus by birth, a rebellious soul by choice, and a protector of the innocent by vocation, Tonks never quite fit into the typical mold. And perhaps that is why, in some parallel magical universe, her true spiritual home was not Hogwarts, as noble and beloved as it may be, but the African wizarding school of Wagadu. Wagadu, carved from the misty mountains of Uganda and shrouded in silvery clouds, is the largest of all wizarding schools and one of the oldest. It is a place where spells are not shouted but felt, where wands are secondary to the raw power of the soul, where transformation is not just learned, but lived. For someone like Tonks, whose very existence was defined by the fluidity of form and the power of magical instinct, Wagadu would have been less a school and more a homecoming. At Hogwarts, Tonks was sorted into Hufflepuff, a house often underestimated but rich in courage, loyalty, and quiet strength. She trained there under the traditional British curriculum: wands, incantations, written exams, dueling club. Her talents were recognized. She became a highly capable aura, one of the few to pass training under the rigorous eyes of Mad-Eye Moody and Kingsley Shacklebolt. Yet, even in that, she struggled with elements that were mechanical or rigid. "I was never any good at stuff that required precision," she confessed once to Harry. Her clumsiness was famous, endearing, and oddly symbolic. She didn't fit into boxes, didn't walk straight lines. She was magic that danced sideways. Wagaduu's teachings focus on disciplines often neglected in European wizarding education: astronomy, alchemy, transfiguration on a soul level. Magic here is not constrained to the flick of a wand, but flows from gestures, from thoughts, from an awareness of one's magical self. And in that sacred space, a metamorph magus wouldn't be an anomaly. They would be a marvel, nurtured and revered. Imagine Tonks learning to shift not just her appearance, but her magical aura, bending light and shadow, blending with the jungle, whispering to the ancestors whose spirits dwell in the land. At Wagadoo, her gift would be seen not as a curiosity, but as a divine inheritance. The students of Wagadoo are known to cast spells using only hand gestures, a form of non-verbal, wandless magic that requires a deep understanding of the self and the currents of the magical world. Tonks, whose gift was entirely physical and emotional, would have flourished in such a setting. Her transformations were often involuntary, driven by mood. But what if she had been taught from childhood to master the inner voice of transformation? At Wagadoo, emotional control isn't about repression, but harmony, understanding the tide of feeling and guiding it like a river through spellwork. For Tonks, whose hair turned mouse brown when she grieved, who lost control of her powers after Lupin's rejection, this guidance could have been life-changing. Consider the profound respect for nature that permeates Wagadoo's philosophy. Tonks, who was so alive, so kinetic, might have been drawn to the ancient rituals that involve communion with earth, rain, moon, and fire. Her natural empathy, her wild spirit, these would not have been tamed, but amplified. Wagadoo teaches that magic is a gift from the world, not just a force to control. Tonks might have learned not only to shift her face, but to become part of the wind, to let her magic run barefoot across the plains. Her transformations could have become sacred acts, not tricks, but rites. In the British wizarding world, Tonks was always slightly out of step. Her pink hair, her leather boots, her refusal to be what others expected. It was all tolerated, but never quite embraced. Even at the ministry, despite her competence, she was viewed with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. At Wagadoo, where magical identity is entwined with spiritual depth, such external eccentricities wouldn't have been signs of rebellion, but of awakening. She would have been celebrated as a walker between forms, a potential shaman, a spirit guide, a bridge between the mundane and the divine. Let us not forget the power of ancestry in the magical traditions of Africa. Wagadoo places immense importance on lineage, not in the rigid blood purity sense of Europe, but in honoring the gifts passed down from the ancestors. Tonks was born to Andromeda Black, a pure-blood who rejected her family's darkness, and Ted Tonks, a muggle-born who defied convention. This union, light and dark, old magic and new life, was itself a form of sacred alchemy. At Wagadoo, Tonks might have traced her magical line back to the primordial spirits of transformation, learned their names, dreamed their dreams. She might have called upon them in moments of fear, not just drawn her wand. Her time at Hogwarts certainly gave her friendship, laughter, and courage, but it also gave her constraints. "Don't call me Nymphadora," she would often bark, bristling at the name her mother chose. In a culture like Wagadoo's, names are sacred, often earned, not inherited. Perhaps Tonks would have had the chance to choose her own name in a rite of passage, something that sang in her own voice. She could have shed the skin of colonial titles and embraced a magical identity forged from her own journey. Maybe she would have become known not as Nymphadora, but as something like Iodel. Joy has come home. Imagine Tonks meditating on a moonlit terrace of Wagadoo, surrounded by carved stone guardians, her hair shifting not from stress or anger, but in harmony with the stars overhead. Each transformation a prayer, each color a spell. With teachers who understood what it meant to live in flux, she could have explored the metaphysical side of her powers. Could a metamorphmagus change their magical signature? Could they become invisible to those who seek them? Could they shift into myth? In Uagadu, discipline is not enforced but cultivated through ritual, respect, and collective energy. Tonks, who was famously untidy and late, might have initially struggled with the rhythm, but over time, the depth of the school's traditions would have appealed to her craving for meaning. She was never careless, just impatient with superficiality. In the chants and dances of Wagadu, in the ceremonial painting of faces and the silence before sunrise, Tonks might have found the discipline she never found in structured classrooms. The school also emphasizes community over competition. In Hogwarts, even well-meaning houses can divide. At Wagadu, the concept of magical harmony includes healing rifts, sharing strength, and learning from the collective. Imagine Tonks learning how to channel group energy to bolster spells, or participating in dream rituals where students share visions to guide each other. Her natural compassion, so crucial later in her life as an aura, would have been sharpened by these communal rites. She might have become not only a fierce protector, but a wise counselor. Consider how her path might have changed. She still might have become an aura, but not one bound to a bureaucratic institution. She could have become a wanderer between worlds, a hunter of dark spirits, a guardian not of laws, but of balance. Wagadu's graduates are known for traveling widely and being called upon in times of magical crisis. Tonks might have walked between continents, speaking to the wind, banishing curses with gestures of the hand, not hexes from a wand. She might have taught others, trained young metamorph magi in ways the British ministry never imagined. Her love for Remus Lupin may still have bloomed. Love, after all, transcends geography. But perhaps in this life she would have met him not in the Order of the Phoenix, but as a fellow traveller on the path of magical healing. Their union might have carried different scars, different strengths. With Uagadu's teachings, Tonks might have better understood how to carry the emotional weight of their bond. When Remus fled from fatherhood out of fear, Tonks broke. Her powers faltered, but in this other world, she might have had tools to stay grounded. Maybe, just maybe, she would have learned how to hold herself with peace in the storm. Her death in the Battle of Hogwarts was a tragedy. Sudden, brutal, unfair. She was a mother, a warrior, a wife, a light extinguished too soon. But in a life where she had trained at Wagadu, perhaps her role in that battle would have been different. Perhaps she would have been one of the spell weavers on the mountainside, summoning protective storms, cloaking the castle in illusions, calling upon ancestral spirits to guard the children. She might have led an ethereal counterstrike, magic from the bones of the earth, not just from the tip of a wand. And yet this is not a tale of regret. Tonks was never diminished by her choices. She was glorious in her imperfections, beloved in her awkwardness. But sometimes we imagine not to mourn, but to understand, to explore what might have been had the world seen her not just as a quirky aura, but as a vessel of deep, ancient magic. Wagadu could have revealed parts of her we never got to see. Not a different Tonks, but a fuller one. When Hermione once said, "You're so brave, Tonks," it wasn't just her courage in battle that she meant. It was her bravery in being herself in a world that often wanted her to be less. But somewhere in the clouds above the mountains of Uganda there is a school that would have never asked her to dim her light. They would have seen her strange and shifting self and called it sacred, a gift, a blessing. Number 20, Fleur Delacour, Mahutakoro. In the glittering halls of Beauxbatons Academy of Magic, Fleur Delacour was a vision of grace. Her Vila heritage shimmered in every step she took, every glance she cast, and every word that passed her lips. But beneath the elegance there lived a fire. Fleur's pride, her relentless pursuit of perfection, and her frustration when underestimated, hinted at a complexity that Beauxbaton never quite managed to mould. One could argue that her place among pale blue silk and floating nymphs was not where she truly belonged. Instead, in a school across the sea, where the wind carried the salt of the Pacific and the mountains bore the weight of centuries, her spirit may have thrived in the disciplined, ancient halls of Mahutakoro. Perched high atop the volcanic island of Minami Iwajima, Mahutakoro is known for its strict codes of honor, its reverence for magical tradition, and the silent pressure it exerts on its students to rise, not just in skill, but in integrity. Fleur Delacour, with her sharp pride and refusal to accept mediocrity, would have fit seamlessly into this environment. Where others might wither under the school's demanding expectations, Fleur would have risen, her wand hand steady, her heart aflame with ambition. The magical robes of Mahutakoro, said to shift in color with a student's progress from pale pink to resplendent gold, would not only have mirrored her growth, but spurred it forward with unrelenting intensity. There was always something too raw about Fleur for Beauxbaton, a school built on beauty, grace, and diplomacy. Fleur did not merely wish to be admired, she longed to be recognized for her strength. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, her disappointment at being underestimated is palpable. "I am not a little girl," she snaps, defending her presence at the Triwizard Tournament. This moment reveals a young woman constantly battling not only the expectations of others, but also her own drive to transcend them. Beauxbaton celebrated her surface, but Mahutakoro might have tempered her soul. The Japanese school of magic does not permit arrogance without discipline. Its students are taught that mastery of magic is inseparable from mastery of the self. This would have appealed deeply to Fleur, who despised appearing vulnerable. At Beauxbaton, her pride was mistaken for vanity, but at Mahutakoro, pride is a reflection of one's devotion to excellence. The school cultivates strength not as a means of comparison, but as a sacred responsibility. Fleur, often judged for her beauty, would have discovered in Mahutakoro a place where appearance faded before character and where reputation was earned through sweat, silence, and magical precision. Fleur's performance in the Triwizard Tournament hinted at a deeper capability that went unnoticed by many. Though her first task, retrieving a golden egg from a dragon, ended in 4th place, she did so with composure and control. In the second task, she plunged into the icy waters of the Black Lake, risking everything for her younger sister, Gabrielle. Though the Grindylows overwhelmed her, the intention was crystal clear. Fleur's love was stronger than fear. In Mahutakoro, where students are taught to revere familial duty and harmony, this act would have elevated her. Her failure would not have been seen as weakness, but as evidence of courage aligned with ancient principles of honor. Moreover, Mahutakoro fosters an aesthetic of inner beauty, the kind that comes from restraint, humility, and discipline. Fleur, often misjudged as shallow or haughty, would have found herself among peers who valued quiet brilliance over flashy charm. In Beauxbaton, her allure was a distraction. In Mahutakoro, it would have been irrelevant. There, her relentless need to prove herself would not have been mocked or misunderstood. Instead, she would have been surrounded by others who also carried the burden of legacy, talent, and the pressure to become more. The robes of Mahutakoro hold their own magic, glowing gold for those who achieve excellence, and turning white with shame for those who stray into dark arts. This magical mirror, always present, always honest, would have been Fleur's perfect adversary and companion. Imagine her, a 4th-year student, trembling with fury not because she had failed an exam, but because her robes had not yet deepened from pink to gold. Imagine her silent vow, night after night, to reach that pinnacle. The school would not have needed to scold her. Her pride would have driven her harder than any professor could. It is not hard to picture her standing in the courtyard of Mahutakoro, the wind snatching at her dark green cloak, the rising sun casting long shadows on the polished stone. A girl surrounded by silence and discipline, no laughter, no careless whispers, just the sound of determination, breathing through her chest like an ancient dragon stirring in its sleep. The delicacy of the sakura trees in the school gardens would contrast beautifully with her burning ambition, reminding her every day that power must be held with grace. Fleur's clash with Molly Weasley later in the series, when she is accused of being too focused on appearances, too aloof, again reflects a misjudgment that Mahout Koro might have prevented. In a culture where self-control is prized, where emotions are not worn on sleeves, Fleur would have learned how to temper her reactions. Mahout Koro would not have demanded she change who she was, but would have shaped her into a woman whose strength came not from defiance, but from calm authority. She would have become less of a flame and more of a sword, gleaming, cold, unbreakable. There is a poignant irony in Fleur's story. She is often portrayed as the outsider, the foreigner at Hogwarts, the beauty queen, the girl who seemed too perfect to be real. Yet what she craved most was not adoration, but understanding. Mahout Koro, with its reverence for discipline and subtlety, would have allowed her to cultivate a version of herself that needed neither defense nor apology. There she might have discovered that being exceptional does not mean being alone. Consider the students of Mahout Koro who are rumoured to join professional Quidditch leagues at very young ages. These young witches and wizards, trained not only in magic but in self-command, operate under strict codes that would resonate with Fleur's unbending sense of self-worth. The school's refusal to tolerate dark arts users, expelling them in disgrace the moment their robes turned white, matches Fleur's own disdain for cruelty and deception. She was never tempted by Voldemort's path, even when many others wavered. In a place like Mahout Koro, her moral clarity would have been honoured as part of her strength. Fleur's marriage to Bill Weasley, a man marked by a werewolf's scars and by war, shows how much deeper she truly was than many first assumed. "Bill is lucky to have me," she said, when Molly doubted her. It was not arrogance, it was a rare, pure honesty. In the culture of Mahout Koro, where emotion is veiled but sincerity reigns, that kind of statement would have been seen not as prideful, but noble. There she would not have had to fight so hard to be believed. While Beauxbaton gave her wings, Mahout Koro might have taught her how to fly with purpose. Fleur's evolution from a dazzling student into a courageous woman was one of quiet, uncelebrated triumph. In the face of war, she stood firm. She fought at the Battle of Hogwarts. She nursed the wounded at Shell Cottage. She never fled, never hesitated. Imagine that Fleur, matured in the ancient corridors of Mahout Koro, moulded by centuries-old magic and the cold discipline of its teachers, walking through the ruins of the final battle, robes gleaming gold, carrying within her the strength of silence. Fleur was not without flaws. Her early moments are laced with condescension, with the need to assert herself. But those traits are often found in people who are aware of their potential and are desperate not to be eclipsed. Mahout Koro could have shown her how to stand tall without needing to rise above others. The school's very architecture, carved into stone, unreachable except by broom or by will, teaches its students humility through isolation and rigor. There Fleur would have learned that greatness requires not only brilliance, but balance. It is said that Mahout Koro's students meditate daily under the guidance of masters, reflecting on their own minds as part of magical training. Fleur, who often burned with emotion, would have found this practice invaluable. Perhaps she would have sat beneath the trees in the stone gardens, hands folded, eyes closed, learning to channel her power inward, not to impress, not to dazzle, but to transform. That is the kind of strength Fleur carried all along, one that just needed a different place to bloom. Even her Vila heritage, often a curse as much as a gift, would have taken on new meaning in a school like Mahout Koro. There, students learn to understand the spirit world, to honor the mystical in themselves. Fleur might have explored her ancestry not as a burden or source of suspicion, but as a unique magical lineage worthy of study and respect. Her magic would have deepened, not only in skill, but in self-awareness, allowing her to wield her powers with dignity rather than defensiveness. Fleur Delacour was a warrior born in silk. She sharpened her courage against ridicule, her power against underestimation. And though her path through Beauxbatons and Hogwarts made her who she was, one cannot help but wonder what she might have become had her journey taken her eastward to the storm-lashed cliffs of Mahutakoro. There she would not have needed to prove her worth. The school would have demanded it, and Fleur would have delivered. Number 21, Albus Dumbledore, Beauxbatons. In the grand corridors of wizarding history, few names echo as powerfully as Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Known as the venerable headmaster of Hogwarts, a brilliant duelist, and a master of transfiguration, his legacy is woven tightly into the stones of the Scottish castle. Yet one cannot help but wonder what might have become of Dumbledore had his path led him not to Hogwarts, but to the ivory towers and marble arches of Beauxbatons Academy of Magic, Charmbaton in its native tongue, a place known for its refined grace, intellectual precision, and artistic reverence for the magical craft. Beauxbatons, nestled in the Pyrenees and bathed in the crystalline light of the south of France, holds a different soul than Hogwarts. Where Hogwarts teaches resilience through chaos, Beauxbatons channels discipline through beauty. It is no coincidence that the palace resembles a fairy tale chateau, for it trains witches and wizards to blend magic with elegance, charm with scholarship. Dumbledore, whose brilliance often took the form of philosophical abstraction and poetic subtlety, might have found the Beauxbatons approach to magic more congruent with his natural inclinations. Consider Dumbledore's love of the arts and aesthetics. His office was filled with delicate silver instruments humming with soft magic, portraits of past headmasters, and a phoenix, Fawkes, whose every cry felt like a lamentation composed by some divine symphony. He surrounded himself not with brute spellbooks, but with artifacts that held stories. In Beauxbatons, where spellcasting is performed with balletic motion and wand work is choreographed like a dance, Dumbledore's natural affinity for grace and complexity would have flourished. He was a man of layers, and the layered teaching methods of Charmbaton would have offered him a deeper mirror of his own inner world. His lifelong preoccupation with the greater good and abstract moral questions aligns with the school's philosophical core. While Hogwarts rewards courage, cunning, loyalty, and intelligence as distinct virtues, Beauxbatons intertwines them under a single banner: refinement of the soul. Dumbledore's tragic friendship with Gellert Grindelwald was forged in the fires of such questions. What does it mean to wield power responsibly? Could one justify control over others in pursuit of peace? Such contemplations find fertile ground in Beauxbatons, where students are encouraged to challenge magical ethics, to read the histories not merely for facts, but for emotional truth, and to craft spells not only to defend, but to elevate. Phileas Flitwick once described Dumbledore as the most brilliant student Hogwarts ever saw, but brilliance comes in many forms. Beauxbatons might have nurtured a different side of him, the artist, the philosopher, the seeker, his tendency to frame even the most mundane matters with flair, nitwit, blubber, oddment, tweak, would not have been met with raised brows at Beauxbatons, but with admiration. His flair for theatricality would have been considered an intellectual virtue, not an eccentricity to be excused. In his youth, Dumbledore was not yet the gentle mentor that future students would come to admire. He was fierce, proud, and filled with ambition. One must not forget the words of Elphias Doge. Brilliant, of course, but somewhat detached, slightly cold, perhaps, in his manner. In Beauxbatons, a school that places tremendous importance on emotional intelligence and introspection, he might have confronted his own distance earlier in life. Their curriculum, steeped not only in spell theory but also in magical literature, philosophy, and ethics, may have offered him the tools to better understand the human heart, a skill he developed only after great personal loss. Beauxbatons, with its ancient magical libraries and scrolls preserved in starlight glass chambers, would have delighted the young Albus. Imagine him poring over alchemical treatises in the Hall of Mirrors, the soft scent of lavender and ink rising as he discovers lost incantations inspired by musical cadence. At Hogwarts, Dumbledore became a master of transfiguration under the stern tutelage of Professor Dallum, but at Beauxbatons, where spellwork often mimics natural phenomena and emotional resonance is considered a component of magical success, he might have pioneered new forms of magic altogether. His relationship with Grindelwald, formed in the shadowed summer of Godric's Hollow, might have taken on a different tone had they met as students at Beauxbatons. While Grindelwald would eventually find himself at Durmstrang, a school steeped in the dark and dangerous arts, one wonders if a shared education in Beauxbatons' more humanist and artistic environment might have softened Grindelwald's path, or at least made Dumbledore more critical of their shared ideology from the start. Perhaps in the gilded halls of Charmbaton, their dreams would have focused more on magical innovation than on dominion. There is also Dumbledore's nuanced relationship with languages and symbols. He could speak Mermish, Parseltongue, through magical means, and Gobbledygook, and he was known for deciphering ancient runes and charms. In Beauxbatons, linguistic dexterity is nurtured as both an academic and artistic pursuit. Spellcasting in different dialects is a central part of the curriculum, with students crafting incantations that harmonize rather than dominate. Dumbledore, whose magic often felt like poetry manifest, would have thrived in such a setting. Even his fashion sense, his famous robes embroidered with moons, stars, and dragon-scale threads, suggests a Beauxbaton sensibility. He wasn't a utilitarian wizard, he was a man who believed in the symbolism of attire. "I would wear a hat full of bees if it amused me," he once said with a wink. In the French Academy, where expression is viewed as a form of magical identity, he would have been celebrated, not merely tolerated. Such a culture may have offered young Albus a stronger sense of self earlier on, lessening his need to hide parts of his personality behind layers of irony and detachment. Beauxbaton's gardens, filled with sentient plants and singing willows, would have fascinated a young Dumbledore. His bond with magical creatures, especially his phoenix forks, was rooted in a mystical respect for nature's secrets. Whereas Hogwarts focused more heavily on discipline and survival-based magical creature studies, Beauxbatons invites communion with these beings. It is a place where nature is not subdued but collaborated with, where sentient groves serve as classrooms and unicorns roam in moonlit orchards. One can easily picture Albus sitting beneath a silver-leaved tree, wand idle in hand, listening to the murmurs of a dryad as she weaves stories into wind. Of course, this is not to diminish the place Hogwarts had in his life. It was at Hogwarts that Dumbledore met Aberforth's stubbornness head-on. It was in its towers that he buried his guilt, honed his patience, and eventually became the kind of mentor he never had. But it is fair to say that his soul, had it been nurtured from youth in the environment of Beauxbatons, might have followed a different cadence, less marked by repression and more by exploration. Dumbledore's own advice to Harry, "It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are far more than our abilities," echoes the ethos of Beauxbatons more than Hogwarts. There, choice is not simply a moral test, but a way of shaping one's magical identity. Their students are encouraged not merely to master existing spells, but to invent their own, infuse them with personal symbolism, and consider their impact on both caster and world. Dumbledore, ever the inventor, ever the ethical tinkerer, would have been Beauxbatons' star innovator, their poetic prodigy. The school's connection to wand lore, especially through its long-standing collaboration with artisans in the Alps, might also have offered him a deeper understanding of the craft. While Ollivanders in Britain held the monopoly of wand-making tradition, Beauxbatons frequently involved students in wand design rituals, where cores and woods are chosen not just for compatibility, but for emotional alignment. Dumbledore's mastery of Elder Wand, an instrument of death reimagined as a tool of protection, speaks to a man capable of understanding the soul of a wand in a way few others could. At Beauxbatons, this understanding would have been a foundational lesson, not a hard-won discovery. In one of his more famous quotations, Dumbledore tells Harry, "Words are, in my not-so-humble opinion, our most inexhaustible source of magic." Beauxbaton has always emphasized the power of language, not merely to command, but to elevate. Spells are taught as expressions of will and soul, not merely formulas. Albus, the lover of metaphor and meaning, would have been an exemplary pupil in such an atmosphere, dissecting magical verse as a scholar might unearth lost poetry. His spellcasting would not have merely stunned or shielded, but told stories, revealed truths, healed wounds. The notion of magical beauty, a concept often overlooked at Hogwarts, sits at the center of Beauxbaton's philosophy. It is not beauty for vanity's sake, but for transcendence. Magic, when performed beautifully, becomes an act of reverence. In this sense, Dumbledore's magic was always of the Beauxbaton variety. Even in battle, his spells shimmered like stained glass, his movements as fluid as ballet. He didn't overpower, he orchestrated. Perhaps this is why he stood out so strikingly at Hogwarts. He didn't quite belong, not entirely. His mind was too abstract for Gryffindor, too emotive for Ravenclaw, too self-critical for Slytherin, and too ironic for Hufflepuff. He existed between categories, between traditions. Beauxbaton, which fosters such in-betweenness as a strength, might have seen him not as an enigma, but as a paragon. It is fitting that in his final moments, atop the astronomy tower, Dumbledore faced death with the calm of a man who had long pondered its meaning. At Beauxbaton, death is discussed not as an enemy but as transformation, an idea mirrored in the school's rites of passage, which include poetic vigils and dream rituals. Dumbledore, who told Harry that, to the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure, carried that Beauxbaton-like philosophy to the end. In a world where the house you are sorted into becomes your destiny, it's tempting to forget how much environment shapes the mind. Dumbledore rose above Hogwarts, became more than any of its four houses, more than even its headmaster. But what if his mind had been shaped elsewhere? In the salons of Chambertin, amid its intellectual gardens and philosophical rituals, the boy who sought the greater good might have grown into a man who never had to sacrifice so much to find it. Number 22, Horace Slughorn, Beauxbaton. Of all the professors who ever walked the polished stone halls of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, few divided opinion quite like Horace Slughorn. Portly, polished, and ever so particular, he was a man more at ease in a velvet-draped sitting-room than in the thick of battle. His love for crystallized pineapple and name-dropping seemed oddly out of place among the rougher edges of the British wizarding world. And though he returned to Hogwarts out of both guilt and duty, it's hard not to wonder whether another magical institution, one wrapped in elegance and refinement, might have suited his spirit far better. Slughorn, in many ways, was a misplaced jewel, and the school that would have truly allowed him to shine. Beauxbaton Academy of Magic. Nestled in the Pyrenees and described as a palace of light and symmetry, Beauxbaton, Chambertin in Russian magical texts, radiated the sort of grace and poise that Slughorn found magnetic. His personality, far from rugged or severe, was the embodiment of polished charm. One might imagine him gliding through the marble halls of Beauxbaton in robes lined with gold, his rotund form bouncing gently as he laughed at some clever quip by a promising student descended from a famous alchemist. The school, under the headship of Madame Olympe Maxime, prized social graces, finesse, and aristocratic bearing. Its students were trained not only in magic, but in the gentle art of cultural sophistication. Slughorn would have been in heaven. His infamous Slug Club, that elite gathering of the rich, the powerful, and the magically gifted, was always tinged with a sense of exclusivity. But at Hogwarts his hand-picked soirees often felt strangely misplaced. Dumbledore tolerated them, perhaps even supported them, but the surrounding environment, a castle steeped in dark secrets and wartime shadows, made Slughorn's obsessions with prestige feel slightly gauche. At Beauxbaton, however, these elegant evenings would be tradition, not eccentricity. Indeed, the school's culture would celebrate his sparkling dinner parties rather than regard them with cautious amusement. Imagine it, a Beauxbaton ballroom shimmering with chandelier light, enchanted snowflakes suspended mid-air as Slughorn oversees a winter banquet. At one end, Celestine Warbeck might croon a siren's lullaby, while at another, a promising potions prodigy from the Montmorency family discusses experimental elixirs. These weren't just social gatherings, they were strategic alliances. And in the safety of Beauxbaton, far from the looming shadow of Lord Voldemort, Slughorn might have embraced his gift for networking with unburdened joy. There would be no need to cower in hiding, as he did during the Second Wizarding War. Here he could build rather than protect. Slughorn was, above all else, a man who understood potential. He told Harry, "I've known a great many clever people. I'd like to think I've made a difference to all their lives." His methods, encouraging brilliance through privilege, might seem flawed, but they were rooted in a genuine desire to nurture talent. At Beauxbaton, where ambition was not shunned but sculpted into elegance, he would have thrived as a mentor. His passion for refinement would have aligned with the school's ideals, and his connections could have elevated its reputation across the magical world. It's no secret that Beauxbaton cultivated a reputation of aristocratic excellence. Families like Delacour and La Roche sent their children there not only to learn, but to be seen. This environment would have suited Slughorn, who famously favoured students with lineage and charisma. At Hogwarts, this was occasionally criticised as favouritism. At Beauxbaton, it would have been strategy. His knack for identifying future influences, like Gwenog Jones, Barnabas Cuff, and of course, Tom Riddle, was a rare talent. In a school that valued image as much as intellect, he could have shaped generations of dignified witches and wizards. Take, for instance, Fleur Delacour. Proud, poised, and talented, Fleur embodied the Beauxbaton ideal. Slughorn would have adored her, not just for her Vila charm, but for her ambition and polish. He would have taken her under his wing, perhaps even introducing her to representatives of the French ministry long before graduation. His mentoring style was deeply personal, and he never hesitated to help his favourites land positions of power. With a school infrastructure that aligned with his values, he could have done so openly, without the veiled disapproval he sometimes encountered at Hogwarts. The potions classroom, too, would have felt different at Beauxbaton. There would be no dungeon-like chambers with damp walls and shadows creeping into the corners. Instead, Slughorn might have instructed students in a sunlit atrium, surrounded by crystalline vials and rare ingredients grown in alpine gardens. His enthusiasm for the subject, too often overshadowed by his social pursuits, would have blossomed in a space that celebrated aesthetics. In such a setting, his lectures would have carried not only knowledge but elegance, as he guided students through the creation of perfumes that could entrance or tinctures that could uplift. Even his wardrobe, always extravagant, occasionally garish, would have found a better audience. At Hogwarts, his waistcoats and velvet slippers drew raised eyebrows. At Beauxbaton, they would draw admiration. He would not need to justify his choices. He would be among peers who valued the same sense of visual magic. As he told Harry, "I like the company of the famous, the successful, the powerful." At Beauxbaton, the very air seemed perfumed with that ambition. His fear of conflict, often viewed as cowardice, would not have been such a burden in a school like Beauxbaton. During the rise of Voldemort, Slughorn chose self-preservation over resistance. "It was the wrong thing to do," he admitted, "but I had to survive." In a French setting less entangled with the war, he might have been spared the moral dilemmas that plagued his later years. "It's not that he lacked courage," he returned, "to fight at the Battle of Hogwarts after all, but rather that his soul yearned for beauty, not bloodshed." At Beauxbaton, he could have contributed to magical society through cultivation, not confrontation. His relationship with students might also have deepened in a school where emotional intelligence was prized. Though he favoured fame, Slughorn was not cold. He wept for Lily Potter's death and respected those who rose with grace. At Beauxbaton, he could have served not merely as a teacher, but as a patron of youthful potential. He would not be hiding from the war, but hosting salons of discovery. His protégés might not have become aurors, but ambassadors, artists, and enchanters. Slughorn's knowledge of magical history, too, would have found fertile ground. In Beauxbatons, where heritage was woven into every tapestry, his stories would become lessons in diplomacy and cultural prestige. He could speak of the time he dined with the head of the International Confederation, or traded recipes with the Queen of the Vila court. His tales, often brushed aside at Hogwarts, would be treasured as oral tradition in a place where storytelling was an art form. His talent for alchemy, subtle and rarely mentioned, might also have been more appreciated. Beauxbatons was known for its progressive curriculum, including advanced branches of magical transformation and refinement. Slughorn, with his deep understanding of rare ingredients and ancient brews, could have pioneered potions that extended life, enhanced beauty, or healed emotional wounds. These were the types of pursuits Beauxbatons celebrated, and here his contributions would not be hidden behind layers of defensive magic and war training. Even his moral complexity, so often a point of discomfort, would be better understood. Slughorn was a man who valued influence but feared responsibility. In a culture where maneuvering through social webs was considered skill, not weakness, he would be seen not as evasive, but as wise. His ability to navigate magical politics would be viewed as mastery. His flaws would not disappear, but they would no longer stand out as glaringly misplaced. Slughorn never claimed to be a hero. He did not seek out danger, nor did he relish martyrdom, but he did seek to build, to shape, and to connect. That, more than anything, would have made him a revered figure at Beauxbatons. Instead of retreating into obscurity, he might have risen as a deputy headmaster or cultural liaison, expanding the school's reach into magical aristocracies across Europe. And one cannot forget the significance of legacy. At Hogwarts, Slughorn's legacy was always overshadowed, first by Dumbledore's brilliance, then by Snape's tragic arc. But at Beauxbatons he might have been remembered as the Renaissance professor who brought international prestige to the academy. Perhaps a wing would bear his name, or a scholarship fund established under his guidance. His story would not end with a reluctant return to a war-torn castle, but with a lifetime of mentorship and ceremonial honor. In the end, Horace Slughorn's essence was not forged for the battlefield, nor the gloom of Gothic towers. It was born of candlelight, laughter, and the fine art of influence. Hogwarts gave him students, but Beauxbatons might have given him peace. It is not that he failed to belong at Hogwarts, it is that he might have belonged more elsewhere. Sometimes the right man is simply placed in the wrong castle, and somewhere in the French mountains a school of grace and grandeur would have welcomed him not as an oddity, but as one of their own. Number 23, Lily Potter, Ilvermorny. In the world of magic, there are choices that define not just one's education, but the course of a life. Lily Evans, the mother of the boy who lived, made hers when she boarded the Hogwarts Express at the age of 11. Yet history, so often composed of silent what-ifs, poses a compelling alternative. What if Lily had not gone to Hogwarts? What if her path had led her across the Atlantic to Ilvermorny School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, a place where her talents, values, and very identity might have flourished in a different kind of soil? From her very first appearance in the Harry Potter series, Lily Evans emerges not merely as a gifted witch, but as a symbol of strength, love, and quiet defiance. Slughorn himself described her as one of the brightest I ever taught. Vivacious, you know, charming girl. She was intelligent and quick-witted, yes, but she was also deeply empathetic. In her school years, she was known not for ambition or power, but for kindness. She was the girl who stood up for Severus Snape when others mocked him. She was the student who, despite being a target of Slytherin scorn for being Muggle-born, never responded with cruelty. This, more than her top marks, made her remarkable. Hogwarts was a complex environment, a microcosm of a society divided by bloodlines. For Muggle-borns, the shadow of prejudice was ever present. Lily endured the whispers and the glares, the hissed word mudblood that cut like a blade. The walls of Hogwarts echoed with these divisions nowhere more loudly than in the rivalry between Gryffindor and Slytherin. And though Lily had the strength to rise above it, one must ask, Was it the right soil for her? Did Hogwarts allow her to become her fullest self, or did it merely teach her to endure? Ilvermorny, by contrast, was founded on the principles of equality and inclusion. Its founder, Isolde Sayre, fled a troubled and violent magical world in search of freedom. She married a no-mage, James Steward, and together they built a school that embraced all magical children, regardless of blood. There was no house founded by a Salazar Slytherin. There was no chamber of secrets beneath its stones. The four houses of Ilvermorny, Thunderbird, Wampus, Horned Serpent, and Pukwoodgi, reflected facets of the soul, not family legacy. It was a school born from exile and healing. It was a school that would have welcomed Lily with open arms. Lily's gifts, both magical and moral, would have been revered at Ilvermorny. Her aptitude for charms, for instance, bordered on the prodigious. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, it is noted that she was able to produce a Patronus, a feat many adult wizards never master. At Ilvermorny, where the Thunderbird House values adventurers and visionaries, or Horned Serpent celebrates the scholar and mind, Lily might have found herself deeply understood. Her soul would not have had to fight daily for legitimacy. At Hogwarts, the intellectual and emotional labor placed on Lily's shoulders was immense. She had to excel, not only to prove herself as a Muggle-born, but to protect her friends, navigate the darkening tides of the First Wizarding War, and confront the agonizing betrayal of Severus Snape, her closest childhood friend. His infamous use of the slur, mudblood, severed their friendship, and though Snape would later dedicate his life to atonement, the cost to Lily was real. At Ilvermorny, such a betrayal might never have occurred, not only because of different individuals, but because the culture itself was less steeped in supremacist ideology. In fact, the very absence of bloodline elitism at Ilvermorny would have freed Lily to focus not on surviving prejudice, but on cultivating her talents and leadership. She might have become a student mentor, a healer, or even a future professor. Her protective magic, which later manifested as the most powerful magical shield in the series, her sacrificial love, suggests a potential affinity for healing arts. This innate power, quietly woven into her very being, could have been nurtured earlier in a school that prized care as much as combat. The environment of Ilvermorny also emphasized collaboration and community. The story of its founding is not one of conquest or competition, but of partnership. 4 beings, 2 humans and 2 magical creatures, contributed to the structure of the school. Lily, who so often found herself acting as a bridge between worlds, between Muggles and wizards, between Gryffindor and Slytherin, between defiance and mercy, might have seen herself reflected in this founding myth. Her very nature was Ilvermornian. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore tells Harry, "The fact that you can feel pain like this is your greatest strength." This quote, meant to explain Harry's capacity for love, also applies to Lily. Her compassion was not weakness, it was the source of her power. At Ilvermorny, such a trait would have been uplifted from the beginning. She would not have had to fight for recognition in a system designed to question her legitimacy. We must also consider Lily's background. As a Muggle-born raised in Cokeworth, she knew early on the reality of marginalization, her sister Petunia's bitterness, her parents' confusion. These formed the backdrop of her life. Yet from the moment Severus Snape first told her she was a witch, Lily embraced the magical world with grace. She didn't recoil or resist, she adapted, she learned, she thrived. That kind of courage would have made her an icon at Ilvermorny, where the marriage of magic and non-magic worlds was foundational, not forbidden. Lily's story is in many ways one of thwarted potential. She died young, at just 21, and yet her legacy is vast. Her son, her magic, her choice to stand between Voldemort and Harry, these shaped the entire wizarding world. But what more might she have done had she not spent so much of her school years navigating a hostile system? What spells might she have invented? What books might she have written? What students might she have mentored into greatness? At Ilvermorny, there would have been less distraction from her development. She would have been surrounded by a different kind of ambition, one focused on exploration, not domination. The Thunderbird House, which favours adventurers, might have encouraged her to study magical flora in the forests of Vermont, or to investigate ancient magic alongside scholars of horned serpent. She might have formed alliances with witches and wizards of diverse backgrounds, free of the fear and suspicion so present in Britain during the rise of Voldemort. There is also a sense that Ilvermorny fosters magic that is ancient, intuitive, and deeply tied to nature. This aligns with Lily's own deeply instinctive use of spells. Her protective charm, so powerful that even Voldemort could not destroy it, was not learned in a textbook. It was born of love. At Ilvermorny, this kind of raw, transformative magic would not have been dismissed as sentimental. It would have been studied, honoured, understood. Even Lily's aesthetic, the wild red hair, the spark in her eyes, the laughter in her voice, evokes something of the American Northeast's rugged beauty. One imagines her walking among Ilvermorny's maple trees, snow clinging to her cloak, wand in hand, eyes full of curiosity. She would not have had to harden herself. She could have expanded, unfolded, flourished. Her relationship with James Potter, too, might have taken a different shape. James, while brave and loyal, took years to mature. At Hogwarts, the social structures encouraged his cockiness and cruelty, at least until his 7th year. In a different environment with different values, it is possible Lily would not have chosen him. Perhaps she would have found a partner whose kindness matched her own. Or perhaps she would have chosen solitude, focusing on healing magic, or activism for magical creatures and marginalized peoples. Imagine then a world in which Lily Evans teaches at Ilvermorny. She walks the corridors not as a target of prejudice, but as its challenger, an antidote. Her classroom is filled with Muggleborns and purebloods alike. She teaches charms, but also ethics. She tells her students not only how to perform magic, but why. Her lessons are inscribed with memory and meaning. Her wand movements are precise, her tone patient. When asked why she became a teacher, she simply says, "Because there is nothing more powerful than choosing to protect." It is not that Hogwarts failed Lily. She succeeded in spite of its flaws, but Ilvermorny might have allowed her to become even more. In that school atop Mount Greylock, where every student is chosen by a house statue and affirmed by a wand's drumbeat, Lily would have stood tall. She would have been chosen, not as a compromise, not as a political gesture, but because she belonged. In the end, Lily Evans Potter was more than just a mother or a martyr. She was the future that never arrived. She was a teacher never hired, a book never written, a movement never founded. But in Ilvermorny, in the classrooms that might have been, her laughter still echoes. And somewhere in the magic of that imagined life, a Patronus in the shape of a doe leaps through the snow, untethered at last, not from death, but from limitation. Number 24, Arthur Weasley, Castelabruxo. Arthur Weasley was never quite like the others at the Ministry of Magic. While others obsessed over bureaucratic rules or polished their robes to perfection, Arthur found magic in the most unexpected places, inside old batteries, car engines, plugs, and rubber ducks. In a world that prided itself on tradition, Arthur's curiosity often made him the odd man out. He was not a powerful duelist, nor a schemer like Lucius Malfoy, nor even a particularly ambitious man. What set him apart was his fascination with the mundane, the non-magical, and the possibilities that lay in the intersection between magic and the ordinary world. And yet Hogwarts, the venerable institution he had attended as a boy, had never quite known what to do with a boy like Arthur. At Hogwarts, Arthur had been sorted into Gryffindor, a house known for its courage and loyalty. But his courage had always been of a quieter sort, not the roar of a lion, but the patient heartbeat of a man who believed in kindness, understanding, and the magic of the everyday. While others were practicing stunning spells or playing Quidditch, Arthur was taking apart old enchanted toasters to understand what made them tick. He spent hours in the library, not poring over books of dark curses or defensive tactics, but buried in obscure texts about the wizarding world's brief encounters with Muggle technology. He had no mentor for these pursuits, no real guidance. His interest was treated as eccentric at best and laughable at worst. Even his colleagues at the ministry chuckled behind his back. Hogwarts, for all its grandeur and tradition, had failed to give Arthur Weasley what he needed most, an environment that nourished his creative curiosity and viewed experimentation not as disruption, but as a virtue. For all its magic, Hogwarts was a rigid place, steeped in history and shaped by rules that left little room for unorthodox dreams. It offered a singular path, excellence within the known, and often dismissed the unknown. Arthur's dreams, quirky and futuristic, found no soil in which to root. He made do with what he had, of course. He built a family that overflowed with warmth. He raised children who carried his courage, his humility, and in some ways his hunger to change the world. But one cannot help but wonder, what if Arthur had studied at Castellobruxo instead? Deep in the Brazilian rainforest, Castellobruxo stood like a living organism, its walls breathing with enchantments, its classrooms grown from the trunks of enchanted trees, and its lessons woven into the very fabric of nature. The school had none of the rigid formalism of Hogwarts. It was a place of transformation, of ecological understanding, of the magical sciences blooming from the organic world. Students did not merely read from books, but learned through communion with the forest, with magical creatures, and with the unseen currents of energy flowing through the living world. Experimentation was the lifeblood of Castellobruxo, and nature was both the teacher and the laboratory. Arthur, had he grown in such an environment, might have become something very different. He might have become not a quiet, underfunded department head at the ministry, but a revolutionary magical engineer, perhaps even the founder of a new school of magical thought. At Castellobruxo, his love of Muggle objects would not have been treated as a curiosity. It would have been welcomed as a question worth pursuing. What happens when the man-made world and the magical world are allowed to speak to one another? It is no accident that Castellobruxo had long fostered a strong relationship with magical innovation. The school produced magizoologists, enchanters, and spellcrafters who viewed magic not as static incantations, but as living forces capable of change and evolution. Students were encouraged to explore, to experiment, even to fail. Within the enchanted rainforests that surrounded the castle, countless magical properties had been discovered. Plants that whispered spells, rivers that altered time, clouds that carried memories. Arthur would have thrived here, not merely because of the openness to experimentation, but because the spirit of the school aligned so closely with his inner world. Imagine young Arthur, a wand tucked behind his ear, walking under the hanging roots of the school's canopy, a Muggle transistor radio floating behind him under a Levioso charm. Rather than hiding his interests in a dingy shed or sneaking Muggle artifacts into his desk drawers at the ministry, he would have had access to an entire department devoted to magical integration with technology. It is easy to picture him poring over magical schematics by the side of professors like Professor Igara Souza, a Castellobruxo inventor known for fusing elemental charms with Muggle tools to create what she called hybrid enchantment devices. In one well-documented example from Castellobruxo's archives, a student named Tiago Lemes enchanted a Muggle wind-up flashlight using a combination of lumos, an indigenous light-binding charm, and enchanted firefly dust. The result? A light source that never needed batteries and responded to spoken magical phrases. Arthur would have loved this. He might have created his own versions, perhaps an enchanted Muggle typewriter that wrote prophetic visions, or a radio that broadcasted ancient spells encoded in static. At Hogwarts, such ideas would be dismissed as nonsense. At Castellobruxo, they would be cause for celebration. It is worth noting that Castellobruxo did not separate magic and the mundane the way Hogwarts did. In J.K. Rowling's books, we often see the British wizarding world sneer at or avoid Muggles. Even Hermione, one of the brightest witches of her age, was often marginalized for being Muggle-born. Arthur was one of the few exceptions, a man who saw wonder in the non-magical world. "What exactly is the function of a rubber duck?" he once asked, not mockingly but with real, childlike awe. That awe would have been understood at Castellobruxo, where the students were taught that magic and life must walk in harmony, that nothing was beneath curiosity. One can imagine Arthur collaborating with young spellweavers to create devices that could help both magical and non-magical communities. Where the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes often worked to cover up Muggle-wizard interactions, Arthur might have been trained to build bridges between the two worlds. A school like Castellobruxo, with its emphasis on cooperation and environmental respect, would have encouraged this. His inventions would not have been confined to the back shelves of a dusty shed, but presented in academic journals, perhaps even displayed in the school's Museum of Magical Ingenuity. When we look at Arthur's career path, head of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office, it becomes painfully clear how little his talents were appreciated. It was a position more designed to prevent harm than to foster creativity. He was meant to regulate, not innovate. And yet Arthur, being who he was, found ways to indulge his curiosity. He modified a Ford Anglia to fly, to become invisible, and even to develop a kind of sentience. That single act speaks volumes about what he might have accomplished in a more supportive educational system. At Castellobruxo, that car might have been the prototype for a fleet of enchanted rescue vehicles designed to navigate terrain where brooms could not. In The Chamber of Secrets, we see the consequences of that car's enchantments when it rescues Harry and Ron. While Molly Weasley is horrified and the Ministry is appalled, readers are left with a different feeling: wonder. That car becomes a character in its own right, a mechanical familiar forged from Arthur's own ingenuity. But because Arthur lived in a society that viewed such creations with suspicion, his brilliance was always half hidden, half apologetic. A different school might have shown him how to harness that brilliance fully. It is also important to consider how Arthur's philosophy of life aligned more with Castellobruxo's teachings than Hogwarts. He believed in empathy, in the value of Muggle lives, in cross-cultural understanding. Castellobruxo, with its connections to indigenous magical traditions and its collaborative approach to education, nurtured those same values. Arthur would not have had to defend his beliefs in such a place. They would have been the foundation. While Hogwarts trained duelists, politicians and aurors, Castellobruxo trained thinkers, visionaries, creators. Arthur might have become a magical technologist whose work blurred the line between sorcery and science. He might have founded a new department at the Ministry, one that sought to use Muggle technology not as a novelty, but as a true component of magical infrastructure. He might have published papers, been invited to speak at international symposiums, mentored students like Hermione, who shared his love of invention. He might have even worked with Muggle scientists in secret, developing new hybrid technologies to improve both worlds. What Hogwarts called eccentricity, Castellobruxo might have called genius. And perhaps Arthur would have believed it too. For all his goodness, he was a man who quietly accepted his place on the margins. He rarely fought for attention or recognition, but in a different context he might have seen himself not as a curiosity but as a pioneer. It is a great irony that in a world where magic can alter reality, so many witches and wizards remain prisoners of tradition. Arthur Weasley was not. He believed in progress, in compassion, in learning from what others discarded. Castellobruxo was a school that believed the same. We can only imagine what might have happened if the boy who once took apart his father's wireless receiver had grown up under the green canopy of Brazil's enchanted forest instead of the stone towers of Scotland. Number 25, Cedric Diggory, Mahutukoro. Cedric Diggory was the kind of boy who made others stand straighter. He wasn't just handsome in the classical sense, tall, broad-shouldered, with ash-brown hair that never quite stayed neat, but he carried himself with the quiet gravity of someone who knew who he was. In a school full of magical prodigies, chaotic personalities, and troubled pasts, Cedric stood apart not because he was dramatic, but precisely because he wasn't. He radiated balance. His sense of right and wrong didn't seem learned. It was intrinsic, like a melody he'd always known. And that perhaps is why he never quite belonged to Hogwarts as much as people assumed. Hogwarts is a magnificent place. It's ancient, proud, and full of contradictions. Each house is a mirror for a specific kind of identity. Cedric, of course, was in Hufflepuff, the house known for loyalty, hard work, and justice. But even within Hufflepuff, Cedric shone in a way that often made others question whether he wasn't missorted. His talent on the Quidditch pitch, his intellect in classes, and his dignified calm during the Triwizard Tournament made many wonder why he wasn't in Gryffindor or even Ravenclaw. But the truth is, Hogwarts was never his ideal stage. It was merely the school he had, not the one he needed. There's a world far from the Scottish Highlands where the wind is softer and the sky 1,000 shades paler. Across the ocean and beyond mountains lies Japan, and on the volcanic island of Minami Iwo Jima, hidden from Muggle eyes, floats Mahutukoro. The name, meaning place of magic, evokes an image of serenity and strict elegance. It is a school built in pink jade, legendary for its exacting discipline, its reverence for tradition, and its insistence that power is meaningless without control. Mahutukoro would have suited Cedric Diggory like a wand finds its true master. In Mahutukoro, robes change color as students progress. They begin a soft pink for the youngest, shifting through shades until they reach gold, an honor achieved only by those who demonstrate mastery of both magic and virtue. Cedric's robes would have turned golden quickly, likely before his 15th birthday, not because he was loud or brash, but because he embodied the school's deepest principles: discipline, restraint, and ethical clarity. Unlike Durmstrang, which glorifies raw power, or Beauxbaton, which prizes style and grace, Mahutukoro rewards the internal, the steady heart, the calm judgment, the sacred self. The Triwizard Tournament showed us who Cedric was under pressure. When Harry told him about the dragons in the first task, Cedric didn't hesitate. He returned the favor before the lake challenge. "Take a bath," he said cryptically, offering just enough to keep things fair. It wasn't just about repaying a debt. Cedric believed in honor as something absolute. In Mahutukoro, where students are expelled the moment they show signs of dark magic, such a moral compass is not just admired, it's essential. He wouldn't have been tested the way Hogwarts tested him, through chaos and confusion. He would have been trained to rise, not simply survive. We often forget that Cedric's death wasn't necessary. The tournament didn't need a fourth champion. Voldemort didn't need him alive. But fate, as cruel as it is chaotic, took him not because he was unworthy, but because he was unguarded. His dignity was the very thing that left him exposed. "Kill the spare," Voldemort ordered. That line still haunts pages and hearts alike. But in Mahutukoro, there would have been no Triwizard Tournament, no Portkey Trap, no final grave in the Hufflepuff section of the Hogwarts Cemetery. There would only have been scrolls with his name etched in golden kanji, testifying to his greatness. Cedric excelled in structured environments. At Mahutukoro, where students often return home each evening by enchanted wind or broomstick, the relationship between family and discipline is close. Honor flows both in school corridors and ancestral shrines. Cedric, raised by a just and humble father like Amos Diggory, would have adapted effortlessly. He would have carried his values into ritual and refinement, studying spells not to impress, but to improve. He would have meditated before duels, bowed to his professors with sincerity, and approached magical theory like philosophy, not just mechanics. His growth would have been uninterrupted by the drama that so often clouded Hogwarts. There's a tale told at Mahutukoro of a student named Ichiro Yamada, who once tamed a thunderbird without a wand, using only his presence and stillness. It's said the beast lowered its wings before him, acknowledging something ancient in the boy's spirit. Cedric had that same stillness. In another life, another place, he might have met such a beast and not needed to speak. Creatures, like people, sense when someone is whole. Cedric was whole. Not perfect, not unbreakable, but integrated. His outer actions always in harmony with his inner truth. Mahutukoro students are required to study the moral implications of magic from their first year. Unlike Hogwarts, where defense against the dark arts is a rotating door of eccentric instructors, Mahutokoro insists on continuity. The professor of ethereal studies, a field unique to Japan, teaches students how magic affects the balance of life. Cedric would have devoured such lessons. He often questioned the meaning behind power. In potions, he wasn't content just to brew correctly. He wanted to know the ancient stories behind the ingredients. He once wrote an essay on mandrake that included references to medieval herb lore, surprising even Professor Sprout. Mahutokoro would have seen that curiosity and sharpened it to a blade. Imagine Cedric at 16, meditating beneath the flowering sakura trees outside the main temple of Mahutokoro, wand resting across his knees, breath aligned with the tide. He wouldn't be thinking of competition or titles. He would be studying the quiet, understanding how silence can become spell, how restraint is the ultimate proof of mastery. That was always his gift, the power to pause when others rush. In a world of noise, he was a hymn. Even his approach to flying would have resonated with Mahutokoro's elite standards. The school is famous for producing some of the best Quidditch players in the world, who go on to join Japan's national team. Cedric's flying was graceful and grounded in physics as much as flair. Diggory's a damn good flyer, even Ron Weasley admitted, despite his bitterness after Gryffindor's loss. His sportsmanship, seen when he insisted on a rematch after Harry fell from his broom, was exactly the kind of spirit Mahutokoro fosters. Victory, to them, is meaningless without grace. It's worth noting that Mahutokoro has the lowest expulsion rate among all wizarding schools, not because students never err, but because the culture instills self-regulation. Cedric, with his composed demeanor, would have flourished in a system that didn't demand perfection, but the pursuit of it. He would have guided younger students, not with arrogance, but with example. Like the mythical figures of Japanese legend, Yamato Takeru or Minamoto no Yoshitsune, he would have become not just a leader, but a symbol. The deeper tragedy of Cedric's life is that his environment never matched his soul. Hogwarts taught bravery, but sometimes rewarded recklessness. It championed intellect, but often indulged superiority. Cedric, in contrast, was the student who helped others with their charms homework without making them feel inferior. He didn't seek fame, yet it followed him. In Mahutokoro, his humility would have been elevated, not ignored. The culture would have reinforced his strengths rather than isolating them as rare exceptions. Consider his final moments, wand in hand, standing in that graveyard, facing a foe he didn't understand. He didn't scream, he didn't run, he stood, he looked, and then he died. That kind of courage doesn't need applause, it needs protection. Mahutokoro, with its emphasis on spiritual strength and the collective welfare, would never have left him alone in the dark. He would not have been a spare. He would have been sacred. In a different universe, Cedric might have walked the halls of Mahutokoro with a spellbook under one arm and a falcon perched on the other. He might have invented new magical techniques that blended Eastern and Western traditions. His name might have become legend not because he died too young, but because he lived so well. His story would not have been a cautionary tale of loss, but an inspiration of what becomes possible when character meets the right soil. There is something profoundly beautiful in imagining Cedric among students whose first lesson is to bow before their elders, whose last lesson is to bow before death. He would have understood that ritual, that rhythm. His life would have been filled with lantern festivals and silent walks through cherry blossom paths, with enchanted katanas and whispered wisdom from teachers who demanded stillness before power. He would have become more than head boy. He would have become a master. The magical world remembers Cedric as a boy who was kind, brave, and undeserving of the end he met. But perhaps the greatest tribute we can give him is not sorrow, but imagination. To envision him not cut down in a graveyard, but standing at the summit of Mahutokoro's jade tower, his golden robes fluttering like banners, his wand inscribed with runes of balance and truth, a place where he belonged, a school that would have honored him, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a living paragon. For those who still whisper his name, remember this. In the right world, Cedric Diggory did not die, he transcended. Number 26, Dolores Umbridge, Mahuta. Dolores Umbridge, the pink-clad tyrant of the Ministry of Magic, is one of the most universally despised characters in the Harry Potter universe, not because she was evil in the same way as Lord Voldemort, but because she embodied the mundane, bureaucratic cruelty that seeps through institutions under the guise of order. Her obsession with control, rules, and obedience made her a menace at Hogwarts, where she clashed with the more rebellious, open-minded spirit of the school. But what if she had been educated elsewhere? What if Dolores Jane Umbridge had walked the polished, sacred halls of Mahuta, the Japanese school of magic, instead of Hogwarts? The outcome might not have transformed her heart, but it could have altered the trajectory of her ambitions and the way she wielded power. Mahuta is not just another wizarding school hidden in a remote mountain range. Nestled atop the volcanic island of Minami Iwo, it is a place of rigorous discipline, clear hierarchies, and deeply embedded traditions. From a young age, students are taught the virtues of precision, excellence, and respect. The color of their enchanted robes, starting from a pale pink and gradually deepening to gold, reflects not only academic achievements, but also moral alignment. For someone like Umbridge, obsessed with appearance and validation, this visual system of merit might have been more than just a source of pride. It could have served as a constant, tangible reminder of the weight of her choices. At Hogwarts, the Sorting Hat placed her in Slytherin. She thrived under the philosophy of ambition and cunning, but lacked the introspection or philosophical depth that many great Slytherins embodied. Her rise within the Ministry of Magic was fueled by her ruthless opportunism and thirst for control. But Slytherin House, despite its dark reputation, valued individual greatness, an ideal Umbridge never truly attained. Instead, she became a cog in a larger authoritarian machine, twisting laws and traditions to serve her need for dominance. At Mahuta, however, such a path would have been less accessible. The school's structure, which reveres harmony, achievement, and ethical conduct, might have forced her to reconcile her desire for authority with the duty to uphold honor. In Japan's cultural context, leadership is not something taken but earned through service and humility. This subtle yet powerful difference is where Umbridge's education could have taken a different shape. At Mahuta, deference to mentors is paramount. Teachers there are regarded as near-sacred figures, with mastery over not just spells but wisdom. Umbridge, had she studied under such teachers, might have learned that true authority comes from respect, not fear. Under the tutelage of a stern but morally grounded master like Headmaster Yoshimura Saito, known for his refusal to bow to political pressures during the Tokyo Magic Congress of 1994, Umbridge's understanding of power could have been radically altered. We must consider, too, how Mahuta treats academic achievement and ethical behavior as inseparable. Their robes do not glow gold without both. Even the most brilliant student loses their color if they practice dark magic or act dishonorably. This unforgiving yet fair system might have put constraints on Umbridge early on, curbing her taste for cruelty before it became part of her nature. A Hogwarts education allowed her to hide behind rules and exploit loopholes, but at Mahuta, the robes would have exposed her alignment long before she graduated. There is something poetic in imagining young Dolores seeing her robe fade from rose to grey in front of her peers after a petty act of meanness, and feeling the shame not of punishment but of public disapproval. In Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore famously said, "You have used your authority rather like a blunt instrument." At Mahuta, she would not have been given such an instrument without proving herself worthy. In fact, she may never have been given it at all. That doesn't mean she would have become kind, but perhaps she would have become better. At Hogwarts, Umbridge was a big fish in a small pond, given free rein by a ministry eager to impose control on Dumbledore's school. Mahuta, however, is not a place where power is handed to the cunning. It is a place where mistakes carry personal consequences. Had she grown up under such scrutiny, the small tyrannies that defined her Hogwarts tenure might never have developed into weapons of institutional oppression. Consider her approach to discipline. In Order of the Phoenix, she forced Harry to write lines using his own blood. "I must not tell lies," the words etched painfully into his hand, is an image that echoes cruelty disguised as justice. At Mahutakoro, such an act would have been grounds for expulsion, not promotion. The Japanese magical education system values restorative discipline, not sadism disguised as pedagogy. Perhaps if Dolores had witnessed how her peers and teachers handled misbehavior with severity, yes, but also dignity, she might have learned to address conflict through authority, not vengeance. The symbolism of Mahutokoro's robes also bears a curious mirror to Umbridge's own obsession with appearances. Her preference for pink cardigans and fluffy kitten plates may seem contradictory to her iron-fisted policies, but they reveal a woman desperate to appear gentle while acting with cruelty. In Japan's magical world, such hypocrisy would be immediately visible. There is no hiding one's character behind a porcelain smile when your robe itself betrays your actions. The visual morality system might have exposed her pretenses and forced her to confront herself, something she never had to do at Hogwarts or the Ministry. Furthermore, Mahutakoro emphasizes cooperation and loyalty to the school over individual ambition. Students train rigorously in both spellwork and flying, excelling together as a unit. Quidditch is not just a game, it is an expression of unity and grace. If Dolores had grown in such an environment, she may have learned that order is not the suppression of others, but the coordination of talents. Her later obsession with control might have been reshaped into a drive for excellence and leadership, still stern, but with a constructive edge. The school's reputation for producing highly skilled, but ethically bound wizards could have also given Umbridge an internal compass. Instead of blindly aligning with corrupt bureaucracies, she may have sought out institutions or causes where her skills would serve the community. In Mahutakoro, students are often recruited into Japan's elite magical task forces, not because they're powerful, but because they are trusted. Dolores, shaped by such a system, might have become a formidable inspector of magical safety, rooting out illegal enchantments or protecting magical heritage sites, not enforcing silence in a classroom with a blood quill. There is a moment in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix when Professor McGonagall, after a painful confrontation with Umbridge, tells her, "You're interfering at Hogwarts." That moment, laced with bitterness, reflects how deeply Umbridge misunderstood the soul of the school. Hogwarts is a place of chaos, creativity, and growth through questioning. Mahutakoro, by contrast, is a place of discipline where structure fosters excellence. Dolores was like a weed in Hogwarts' garden, but she may have been a well-trimmed bonsai under the hand of a master gardener in Mahutakoro. Dolores' interest in magical lore and her rise through the ranks of the Ministry were never in doubt. She was intelligent, cunning, and politically astute, but her education at Hogwarts gave her no inner counterweight, no ethical spine to temper those ambitions. In contrast, a Mahutakoro education is just as rigorous in magical theory as it is in spiritual responsibility. Students are expected to understand the consequences of their magic, not just its mechanics. If Dolores had been required to reflect on the impact of every incantation she cast, every policy she helped shape, she might have seen power not as a weapon, but as a burden to carry wisely. The culture of silence and avoidance that surrounded her at Hogwarts would not have existed at Mahutakoro. The Japanese school fosters peer responsibility, where students hold each other accountable in quiet, powerful ways. Imagine a younger Umbridge burning with pride after receiving praise for her wand work, only to have her robe lighten after being exposed for mocking a fellow student. That kind of humiliation could have triggered transformation, not out of guilt, perhaps, but out of fear of losing status in a system that demanded visible integrity. One must also remember that Mahutakoro is deeply integrated with nature and spiritual tradition. The school sits on sacred volcanic rock, and legends speak of spirits that walk the grounds. Students are taught to respect not only human rules but also the balance of the magical world. Had Umbridge been immersed in this worldview from childhood, it could have bred in her a reverence for magical life forms, not contempt. The very idea that she would later order the expulsion of centaurs from the Forbidden Forest might have horrified the Umbridge trained under the Mahuta Koro ethos. It is tempting to see Umbridge as irredeemable, a figure so lost in her own vanity and righteousness that no education could have saved her. But education is not merely about content, it is about context, about values transmitted in every hallway, every robe, every ritual. Hogwarts did not shape Umbridge, it tolerated her. Mahuto Koro would not have. It would have confronted her silently but forcefully every time she acted out of cruelty or ego. It's possible that even at Mahuto Koro she would have resisted introspection. But the pressure to conform not just to rules but to ethical excellence may have produced a different kind of witch, perhaps one still strict, still enamored with formality and decorum, but no longer cruel. A bureaucrat, yes, but one who understands that justice is a service, not a punishment. In the end, Mahuta Koro would not have made Dolores Umbridge into a hero. But it might have made her into something far more valuable, a functional part of society, restrained by a culture that demands more than blind loyalty and dogma. She might have left the school with gold-tinged robes, not as a mark of power, but as a reflection of discipline earned, respect given, and cruelty curbed. Such an education might not have erased the worst parts of her, but it could have isolated them, contained them, taught her to fear their consequences. Hogwarts let those shadows flourish in silence. Mahuta Koro would have lit them with a lantern, and required that she bow to the light. Number 27, Aberforth Dumbledore, Castello Bruxo. Of all the names that echo through the pages of wizarding history, Aberforth Dumbledore's is one that rarely seeks attention. Unlike his elder brother, the legendary Albus Dumbledore, Aberforth walked a quieter path, shaped not by fame or intellectual ambition, but by solitude, animals, and the unspoken burden of grief. When one considers his nature and life choices, a curious question arises. What if Aberforth had studied not at Hogwarts but at Castello Bruxo, the hidden magical school deep in the Brazilian rainforest? His life, perhaps, would have taken on a different rhythm, one less shadowed by loss, betrayal, and the overbearing legacy of his brother. Castello Bruxo, nestled within the lush, pulsating heart of the Amazon, is a place where the boundaries between the magical and the natural blur until they are indistinguishable. The school's curriculum is rooted in the understanding of magical creatures, herbal lore, and the protection of the natural world. It thrives not on intellectual competition or political ambition, but on balance, connection, and survival in harmony with magic as it lives and breathes in nature. Aberforth, with his deep connection to animals, particularly his beloved goats, would have found in Castello Bruxo not just a school, but a sanctuary. Aberforth's time at Hogwarts was marked by detachment and disinterest. He was, by his own admission, not academically inclined. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows he speaks bitterly of his school years and the pressure of living in Albus's shadow. "He always did have a thing for brains, did my brother." It's a line weighted with resentment, not only for the admiration Albus received, but for the way Hogwarts rewarded intellect over intuition, theory over instinct. Castello Bruxo, where instinct is not only valued but vital, might have given Aberforth a sense of worth he never found in the stone corridors of Hogwarts. His affinity for animals went far beyond hobby. It was communion, almost sacred. Goats were more than companions. They were a connection to something unspoken and healing. Though the Ministry once fined him for inappropriate charms on a goat, the incident says more about his closeness to magical creatures than about any misconduct. In Castello Bruxo, where students are trained to live among creatures like the Curupira and the Kaipora, his talents would have been not strange, but celebrated. The caretakers of Castello Bruxo, fierce, capricious forest spirits, value those who can approach nature with humility and patience. Aberforth might have been one of the few to earn their quiet approval. The social dynamics of Hogwarts, particularly during the Dumbledore brothers' youth, were not kind to those who walked a different path. Aberforth, with his blunt honesty and emotional restraint, struggled to fit in. He carried the weight of family tragedy with a silence that Hogwarts had no room for. The death of Ariana, the trauma of the duel that killed her, and the estrangement from Albus all happened in an environment ill-equipped to offer healing. Castellobruxo, far removed from European expectations and rigid magical aristocracy, might have allowed him the space and spiritual grounding to process these wounds. The jungle breathes differently. The students of Castellobruxo live among ancient trees that speak in rustling tongues and rivers that remember. Magic is raw and old there, untamed by the formulas of European academia. Aberforth, who never cared for books but had a deeply instinctive understanding of magic, might have found this style of education liberating. He learned not through theory but by doing, tending, observing, listening. It is not hard to imagine a young Aberforth crouched by a shimmering creek, hand outstretched toward a shy, flickering Yara, gaining her trust not through spells, but stillness. His future might have been shaped by a different kind of purpose. Perhaps he would have become a magizoologist, traveling the rivers with native wizards, cataloguing and protecting endangered magical species. His stubbornness, often misread as hostility, would have become an asset in the dangerous, ever-changing terrain of the Amazon. Unlike the professors of Hogwarts, Castellobruxo's mentors would have valued his silence, his endurance, and his empathy with animals. He might have become one of the few trusted to study the elusive Mapinguari or to negotiate peace with a rogue band of enchanted anacondas. Even his grief might have found a gentler path. Castellobruxo teaches not only magic, but respect, for life, for death, for the forest's ancient cycles. The trauma of Ariana's death might have met an environment where loss is not dismissed but embraced as part of nature's rhythm. He might have learned not to carry her memory like a wound, but to honor it like a seed. Buried, yes, but growing. In the endless green, surrounded by voices that do not speak but always listen, Aberforth might have found peace. It is worth imagining what kind of man he would have become. The Aberforth we meet in the books is kind in the roughest, rawest way, not soft, but solid. He protects, he endures, he does not ask for praise. But there is a sadness in him, a coarseness that feels like it formed in defense, not in essence. At Castellobruxo he might have remained gruff, but less wounded. The man who operated the Hog's Head in grim isolation might instead have become a mentor in the jungle, a quiet guardian of students and beasts alike. In Brazil, he would have never been Albus's brother. He would have been just Aberforth. Free from comparison, free from expectations, he could have grown not in reaction to others, but in harmony with himself. His name would not be a footnote to a greater story, but a tale all his own. And perhaps years later his former classmates would have spoken of him with reverence, the boy who once calmed a rampaging thunderbird with nothing but a glance and a hand on its beak. Even his goats, so often the subject of jokes, take on new meaning in this context. In ancient Amazonian lore, animals are not lesser beings, but teachers, guides, protectors. The bond Aberforth formed with his goats would not have been seen as eccentricity, but as spiritual kinship. Perhaps he would have bred a new, magical variety, jungle goats with horns of silver and hides that shift color with the wind. In Hogwarts, this would be absurd. In Castellobruxo, it would be a gift to the forest. The Dumbledore family legacy, its genius, its ambition, its crushing expectations, would have had no power in the rainforest. Castellobruxo cares not for lineage. It does not measure students by name, but by how they move through the jungle, how they listen to the silence. Aberforth, unburdened by family myth, might have discovered that his worth was never dependent on being the opposite of Albus. He could have simply been himself, and that would have been enough. Even his relationship with magic might have evolved differently. In the world of British wizardry, magic is a subject. In the world of Castellobruxo, magic is a force to be in relationship with. one that has moods, memories, and morality. Aberforth, who never chased mastery, might have become a partner to magic, not its wielder. His spells would be quieter, deeper, drawn from the earth, not the page. A flick of his hand would carry the weight of instinct, not instruction. The battle at Hogwarts, where Aberforth fought bravely alongside the Order, shows what he might have become under different circumstances. He was not just a bystander, he stood between evil and the vulnerable, not for glory but for love. Imagine if that bravery had been nurtured in a place that celebrated the protector, the empath, the unseen strength. Imagine if he had been trained not to fight like his brother, but to heal, to shield, to preserve. When one thinks of Castelabruxo's stone guardians, the ancient sentient statues who watch the grounds with moss-covered eyes, one cannot help but imagine Aberforth sitting beneath one, a goat beside him, both at peace. Perhaps he would have written scrolls of his own, not scholarly treatises but stories, songs, field sketches of beasts no other wizard had ever seen. Perhaps he would have loved not in the tragic, unspoken way he carried in Britain, but openly in a culture where emotion was not weakness, but wisdom. His life would still have had challenges. The jungle is not a gentle place, but its tests would have suited him, physical, moral, elemental. It is a place where survival depends not on strategy, but sincerity. The very qualities Hogwarts dismissed, his earthiness, his directness, his refusal to play social games, would have become his tools, his strengths. Even his wand might have found different wood, not ash, but jatabar or pau Brazil, imbued with rainforest spirit. Perhaps it would glow not with light, but with moss, or hum like a living thing. His Patronus, a goat, unassuming, but fierce, would not be mocked, but honoured. There is no bitterness in this imagining, only a quiet wondering. Aberforth Dumbledore was never a failure. He was a man misplaced, a soul planted in soil too cold. Castelabruxo might have been the rich, loamy earth where his roots could stretch, where he could grow not twisted but tall. And in that world, somewhere deep in the jungle, the quiet boy with the sad eyes and the steady hands would have found not only knowledge, but wholeness. Number 28. Kingsley Shacklebolt, Wagadu. Of all the figures to rise through the ranks of the Ministry of Magic, few command the same quiet authority and dignified presence as Kingsley Shacklebolt. Introduced as a high-ranking aura, and eventually becoming the Minister for Magic himself, Kingsley is a man whose strength lies not in loud displays of power, but in strategic restraint, deep thought, and unwavering commitment to justice. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, he seamlessly plays the part of a ministry employee while secretly protecting Dumbledore's interests, showing his masterful ability to balance dual roles without compromise. "Dumbledore's got style," he once said, calmly observing the headmaster's dramatic escape. But Kingsley, in truth, has just as much style, though of a quieter, more calculating kind. It begs the question, what kind of wizard would he have become had he not been shaped by the culture of Hogwarts, but rather by the teachings of Wagadu? Wagadu, the great African school of magic, carved into the side of the mountains of the moon, is known for its profound connection to natural forces, astral magic, and inner transformation. It emphasizes the subtle art of magic, rooted not in incantation alone, but in deep spiritual discipline and harmony with nature. In contrast to Hogwarts' often externally focused curriculum with its dueling clubs, house rivalries, and a strong emphasis on British magical traditions, Wagadu fosters silence, introspection, and the nurturing of inner power. For Kingsley, a man whose essence is defined by composure and insight, such an environment might not only have enhanced his gifts, but transformed him into something even more powerful, a mage whose inner and outer worlds move in perfect unison. There is little doubt that Kingsley mastered the curriculum at Hogwarts. A brilliant student, he would have excelled in defense against the dark arts, charms, and even potions, subjects that reward careful observation and precision. But his talents suggest a soul meant for deeper currents. At Uagadou, wandless magic is not merely encouraged, it is expected. the school teaches its students to channel magical energy through will, body, and thought alone. Kingsley's often wordless spells in battle, like the silent stunning spell he uses during the raid at the Department of Mysteries, hint at a natural affinity for such methods. He did not need the rigid formality of a wand to express power. He needed a space to connect inward, a temple rather than a fortress. Wagadu's focus on transfiguration also aligns with Kingsley's hidden skills. He is never flamboyant about it, but transformation is at the heart of his work, turning chaos into order, fear into courage, secrecy into protection. The African school teaches transfiguration not merely as a physical process, but as a metaphor for self-mastery. To change the world, one must first change the self. Students are taught to dream in symbols, to interpret celestial signs, and to channel ancestral strength. Imagine Kingsley at the summit of the mountain, meditating under the stars, learning from a wise professor like Magoma Zibanda, the known headmistress of Wagadu, who is said to understand the language of storms and animals. Under such guidance, Kingsley would not have learned magic alone, but also the sacred responsibility that comes with wielding it. His sense of justice, so fundamental to his being, would have found fertile ground in Wagadu's teachings. While Hogwarts bred bravery through confrontation, sorting students into Gryffindor, Slytherin, and so on, Wagadu bred strength through harmony. The African approach is not one of conquest, but of balance. Kingsley, who later became a unifier during a fractured time in the wizarding world, could have learned these lessons earlier, not through political turmoil, but through spiritual guidance. His gift was always one of cohesion, not destruction. Perhaps he was meant to be a healer of communities, not a soldier,